Chapter 1. Rebirth. The doctor moved his stethoscope away from the child's chest while glancing at the test reports before him. The data was very clear. Unfortunately, it's a non-type 2 inflammation type of severe asthma. What does that mean for him? The child's mother asked as she gripped the child's hand harder. It's a chronic type of asthma that doesn't respond well to drugs or steroids. Unfortunately, it seems to be particularly severe in his case. His lungs are crippled and he'll need to take regular nebulizations just to lead a semblance of a normal life. She shook when she heard that. As for the boy, he didn't understand a word of what was being said, but his mother's somber anxiety had trickled into him. He felt his throat choking up, as tears welled up, threatening to spill despite his furious endurance. His breathing grew more agitated and labored as the conversation progressed, and his mother's despair grew more palpable. He felt like he was trekking a mountain. He felt like he was being snuffed by a pillow. He felt as though the air was growing thinner. "Mom!" he desperately gasped as he began crying. "John!" She held his face in her hands. He could feel her fear through her quivering palms. "I need 5 milligrams of albuterol stat." The doctor immediately paged. "Calm down, son." The doctor calmly coaxed immediately after. "Take a deep breath, everything is okay." He was lying. The boy didn't know how he knew, but he knew in his heart that the man was lying. His vision grew red as he felt his mind blurring. He whispered as he struggled to hold onto her. The last thing he heard before he lost consciousness was his mother screaming his name. John woke up with a jerk, breathing heavily and coarsely, drenched in sweat. It took him only a moment to remember. The same nightmare flashback. The worst kind of nightmares were the realest ones. He'd rather have the stereotypical free falling off a building nightmare, but nope. He would relive the worst day of his life. The day he was diagnosed with severe chronic asthma, a curse that crippled his dreams and passions, shackling his body. The things I would have accomplished if it wasn't for this goddamn disease, he managed to choke out, while still gasping for air. Sports, exercise, travel, treks, and of course, what he yearned for most. Martial arts. John Falcon was a lover of martial arts. Ever since he laid his eyes on Enter the Dragon, the first martial arts movie he had ever watched, he could never get over how amazing they were. How could he? The way they moved enraptured him, their stances, their checks, their footwork, grapples, and of course, their strikes. He'd spent his entire life dedicated to them, albeit not in a way that one would expect a lover of martial arts would. He was born with severe asthma, preventing him from ever engaging in any physically intensive activities, martial arts included. So instead of practicing them, he decided to dedicate his life to learning about them. If he could not study martial arts as a practitioner, he would do so as a scientist. By the age of 25, he had obtained a bachelor's degree in physics and a diploma in human anatomy, and a minor degree in statistics and probability. Armed with the knowledge of these 3 fields as his foundation, he spent all his time performing research on martial arts and combat sports. He would perform surveys, studies, and experiments on different martial arts, and gather data on several variables and attributes on them, and draw conclusions as well as hypotheses based on them before publishing them in respected peer-reviewed journals. As the advent of MMA and UFC truly arose as a major industry with a large market for combat sports entertainment at the birth of the 21st century, his work became the foundation for modern MMA. The sudden rise in the significance of martial arts in the 21st century was a dream come true to John. He built upon to publish research that would become the bread and butter of combat sports. And then, he died. At the age of 59, his already compromised lungs collapsed and he passed away a peaceful death. He'd spent his entire life dedicating his heart and soul to the one thing he loved, and died loving it, while still cursing the shackles that prevented him from truly embodying it. Yet, this was not the end. John stirred as he felt a strange sensation enveloping him. Didn't I die? John wasn't sure what was happening, but he was relatively certain he was to die when he last felt his consciousness slipping in the hospital, his last sight being that of hastened doctors injecting him with something or the other. I guess not. But what the fuck did they wrap me in? A jelly-coated condom? He could barely move, yet could feel that he was in a fetal position though. I'm going to sue these motherfuckers so hard, there is no way this falls within ethical practice. Can't they just let me chill in peace for fuck's sake? He cursed. Just then, he felt a force pushing onto him. It seemingly pushed down on his butt, attempting to push him through what seemed to be an opening of some sorts. At this point he was positive that something was definitely off. He was just far too bewildered and frightened to even attempt making heads or tails of this situation. A few seconds later, he felt his body being forced out of an opening, and that's when he panicked, calling for help. "Wah!" was what actually escaped his mouth. Did I just cry? He opened his eyes only to behold a giant woman holding him. No, she's not giant. I'm the one who's small. He barely managed to glance with his stubbornly half-closed eyes at his clenched folded tiny arms, horrified. Quick, treat her. Her breathing is dangerously shallow and pupils are dilated. What ensued was a long session of attempting to stabilize his biological mother's condition. The presumed doctors and nurses all diligently performed variety of actions with great determination, but alas, to no avail. Slowly but surely, her eyes lost their light, yet they never once turned away from John. Time of death, 1742. John didn't understand the language they spoke, but he understood what had happened. Although he still half believed this was some hallucination, he felt a pang of grief even as his consciousness drifted away. Fuck me, please let this be a dream. Alas, fate deigned to ignore his wish, yet again. He woke up later that evening in a daze, yet he needed only one moment to know that that was no hallucination. He really was reborn as a baby, despite how absurd the notion seemed to him. He was in a rather small medical room, waddled in a thick towel in a wooden cradle. The room had windows on opposite sides of the room, one leading outside and the other to the corridor where he could see nurses and doctors walking through occasionally through the gaps in cradle. He glanced around only to realize he was not alone. There were several other babies just like him in their own cradles. An incubation room. He sighed. He hadn't the faintest idea where he was, but judging from the foreign language they spoke in, as well as the difference in clothing and even architecture, he was far, far away from the US. It's not just that, the technological level of this place is really low. Incubation rooms like this are filled with devices that monitor babies' vitals. Furthermore, there was no electronic technology when they delivered me either. Even this room doesn't have any lights, just lamps. That being said, the lamps were strange. The source of light was not fire, which flickered, whereas the lamp's light did not waver. It most certainly wasn't electricity. In fact, as far as he could tell, there was no electricity in the room at all. It really was a bewildering notion to someone from the 21st century. Was there really a nation with such primitive technology? John wasn't sure. This is insane. This shouldn't be fucking possible. What the fuck is happening? Assuming he was reborn, he didn't know if he was even reborn in the 21st century. What if he was reborn in a dystopian future? Or the past? No, wait, is this even Earth? He didn't know yet, but he would find out sooner or later, assuming he had anything resembling a life he used to have. These experiences had shattered his subjective worldview of reality. Only time would tell what his new one would end up looking like. He braced himself, in fear and partially with a tinge of excitement, for his future to unfold. Chapter 2, Exploration. It had been nearly a month since John had been reborn, and not much had changed since then. His days were spent mostly in his cradle, which drove him mad with boredom. The novelty of being reborn had long passed. Hospital personnel would feed him, bathe, and change his diaper, the latter of which was humiliating for a grown old man. Still, he enjoyed this feeling of youth. The feeling of inhaling massive amounts of air, invigorating every single cell in his body, was truly addictive. He felt as if he was overflowing with limitless energy that he urged to expend. His mind felt fresh, and his body felt comfortable. He would often spend his days trying to move around as much as he could within his cradle. But his body was far too weak to do much at this stage. He would often spend time contemplating his future and gathering as much information about anything he could. He even learned his own name in the process. The nurse always addressed him with Rui. A strange name, but one he was beginning to get used to. As for his surroundings, he'd already noted several oddities about this place. For starters, the race of the humans he'd come across was unclear. There was no skin color that seemed to be the norm. Both men and women ranged from light skin to dark. But this wasn't the strange part. The strange part was their hair. Are they coloring it? Does this country have a fad or something? He had seen hair of almost every primary and even secondary color. Red, blue, yellow, green, purple, blonde, silver, pink, etc. This was a rather shocking sight to a man from a world of mostly black, blonde and little red hair. In fact, he had come across only one person with black hair. Himself. He was accustomed to this since he had black hair in his previous life as well, yet it seems black hair was not only not the norm, but also exceedingly rare. Of all the countless people that had walked past the corridor in the past month, he hadn't seen a single person with black hair. The second equally strange thing he had noticed were the eyes. People's eyes' color was all over the place. Just like with hair, he found a spectrum of every single color except, yet again, his own eye color, black. Both his eyes and hair were pitch black, something that was strange too, as if they sucked the light out of the world. He suspected that these traits were rare, perhaps even ominous based on the fearful, perhaps even disdainful glances that some people would throw at him. I hope that isn't the case. He sighed. In any case, this world definitely isn't Earth. There were no races with such hair and eyes. Just then, the door opened and he glanced at the nurse who was assigned to him. She was accompanied by a blonde-haired woman who looks to be in her late 30s wearing something that resembled a fusion between a gown and a traditional yukata. The nurse lifted and passed him to her as they conversed, though he wasn't sure he understood what they were conversing about. The blonde-haired woman played with and smiled at him while occasionally asking the nurse questions. 10 minutes later, after she seemed to sign some paperwork, she left the hospital with him. Figured this day would come. 1 month in a hospital is way too much. He mused to himself, but he welcomed the change. Finally, he could learn more about this world. He glanced around and took in the environment. The first thing he noticed was that technology was most strange. It was primitive compared to the 21st century on Earth, but it was esoteric and didn't seem to match the historical technological progression of humanity on Earth. Their lighting sources were still a mystery to him. Their medicine was also strange. They used strange concoctions and apparatuses while tending to him. He had no frame of reference for them because he couldn't recall any such equivalent in Earth's history. There's something very different about this world, that's for sure. A minority of people carried belongings in makeshift bags made from cloth. It seemed only a larger majority used handbags or other carrying articles. The sense of fashion was strange. It was a mix of middle-aged Western and Eastern clothing. It seemed both men and women wore clothing that generally enveloped their entire body. This was generally a trend that existed prior to the Industrial Revolution that allowed for the production of clothing articles with a more sophisticated and difficult production process. This would suggest that their technology was low, but the architecture of buildings was rather pristine considering most of them were residences or small-time shops, not something he would expect from medieval Earth. These oddities threw him off. He wasn't sure how to evaluate their technological prowess. The weather was beautiful, the sun shone bright, yet the presence of adequate number of clouds shielded the surface from much of its wrath. Cool winds blew, rustling the leaves and cherry blossoms of trees and grass that populated the sidewalks. It was truly a picturesque sight to Rui, a sight that could seldom be found on modern Earth. The stone roads were populated with bustling citizens buzzing between what seemed to be a flea market of domestic goods and services set up in small stalls or shops. Just as he was admiring and absorbing his surroundings, the blonde-haired woman waved her hand and called out to a man pulling a rickshaw. She quickly got on with Rui after exchanging a few words with the rickshaw puller, before he started pulling them away at a brisk walking pace. An economical occupation with a low barrier of entry. He noted there were plenty of traveling rickshaws he spotted as they crisscrossed through the town. They traveled further and further away from the bustling populated markets, before soon they reached a house with a huge fence. Before they got off, Rui noticed that the blonde-haired woman paid him off with what looks to be a bronze coin. The coins are remarkably intricate. How can their most common and universal currency be so sophisticated without electricity? Maybe I really have underestimated this place. The house was a little worn down. The paint had significantly worn off and the building was chipped and cracked at multiple areas, albeit small enough to not be dangerous. Still, the garden was surrounding the house seemed well maintained and all in all it painted a homely image. The blonde-haired woman carried Rui to the entrance before knocking. Yes. A young red-haired woman opened the door slightly, only to beam in joy, as her eyes fell on the woman holding him. Mother Lashara. Lashara is her name? Rui wondered. Alice. Lashara smiled back. Welcome back. Alice replied before turning to Rui with a curious expression. So this is him? The black-haired, black-eyed baby that no orphanage accepted for a whole month? Yes, the poor child has been alone during the most tender moments of his life. I couldn't help myself after seeing how cute he was. Alice cooed and cuddled at him before taking him in and showing him off to the others. So this is where I'll be living from now on, eh? Rui pondered. This I can get used to this. Chapter 3, Shocking Revelation. Sean. Alice smiled at Rui holding a spoon of porridge near his mouth. It had been 11 months since Rui had been born. He had grown accustomed to the mundane albeit pleasant life that he had come to be living for the past 10 months. Still, although he had very few tribulations as an 11-month-old, he would notice that the state of the orphanage was not what his comfortable life would lead him to think it was. Life was hard. The 21st century had the highest quality of life in the history of Earth, and only got better and better every year due to growth in technology. But this was a world in its Middle Ages. Even basic necessities that he took for granted on Earth, such as easy access to food, shelter, and security were difficult to obtain, and even harder to maintain for the lowest of the middle class and lower. The risks and consequences of failing were much harsher too. He could tell that the financial state of the orphanage was poor. The condition of the orphanage left some to be desired. He wasn't sure where the orphanage managed to scrape the necessary money to sustain itself, but he was sure it was far from easy. Orphanages were a non-profit organization, They usually made their ends meet by donations or in rare cases subsidies, though clearly this orphanage struggled with those. The sisters would often forego eating meals so that the children of the orphanage could eat fully. He could sense the anxiety hidden behind their smiling facades when they fed the hungry children. Sigh, to feed a helpless, worthless baby like me, they sacrifice much, they endure much. He couldn't help but feel guilty. When I'm older, maybe I can use my knowledge to earn a large amount of money. I'll support them myself. They already think I'm a genius after all. As an adult mentally, Rui was able to learn languages much quicker through active learning. He quickly remembered everybody's names first, followed by basic greetings, words he came across most, such as food and eat, before making his way across a large portion of the common language. He could form basic coherent sentences by 10 months, and had grown more comfortable and fluent with them by 11 months. The orphanage considered him a genius. After all, what baby could speak so well before it even turned 1 year old? The rate of growth of his speech was more than thrice of than that of the average child. Of course, as an adult, Rui didn't feel very smart. 10 months of non-stop practice only to be able to speak as well as a 4-year-old was actually rather embarrassing, even, but of course that was without any active help or learning resources, and purely from observation and deduction. But he could use this rate of growth to get a well-paying occupation to support his new family in the future. For now, he indulged himself in the food his body needed to grow up strong. How's the porridge, Rui? Is it tasty? I added extra pepper just as you wanted. Alice smiled as she fed him another spoon. It's really tasty, sister. Rui replied with as much sincerity as he could fake. In truth, he hated porridge. As someone from the middle class of a first-world country, he was accustomed to much better food than porridge, but this was something Alice had personally made for him, with a lot of love and care. He did not dare hurt her feelings out of his privileged lifestyle. Besides, he did need to eat. Nutrition was most important for a child his age, and malnutrition could screw him forever in the worst-case scenario. This was not something he could tolerate, as someone who suffered from poor health for a lifetime. As a former chronic asthma patient, the feeling of air gushing into his lungs and invigorating every cell in his body was addictively satisfying. That also means I can practice martial arts in this world, he reminded himself excitedly. Ever since he was reborn, he realized that the fact that his body did not seem to be hindered by any health ailments meant he could do all sorts of things he never could before, with the number one activity on his list being martial arts. Fuck yes. This is by far the most exciting part of being reborn. He couldn't wait until he was old enough to start practicing martial arts. Alice, the squire you called to clear the fallen tree trunk blocking the back exit is here. Karin, another caretaker of the orphanage, informed. Squire? Rui inquisitively inquired. He'd never heard anyone mention that phrase so far. Ah, you don't know yet. Well, would you like to come and see? Alice put down the bowl of porridge and gestured at him to follow, which he did out of curiosity. The man waiting outside the house was extremely tall and ridiculously buff. He wore what looks to be a gi, something that resembled training uniforms, but his muscles could not be hidden despite his loose baggy clothing. His head was partially clean-shaved, while his remaining hair was neatly braided in a single long ponytail. Wait a second. Rui's eyes lit up. Is this a martial artist? It's over there. Alice guided him to the back where a huge tree trunk had fallen and blocked the gate. I see. Then please take several steps away. The man nodded at the sight, before taking a martial arts stance. He'd stood before the fallen tree before putting his left foot forward and his right leg back. He folded and brought his left arm forward, with his forearm perpendicular to the ground and his fist pointing to the sky. It was a common stance for launching a straight right in most martial arts. Yet it seemed as though the man intended to use it to clear the tree. Rui's eyes flew wide open at the sight. What is he, tree floating tiger fist style? Roaring impact. The man whispered. What followed next shocked Rui from head to toe. Every cell in his body froze as if they each wished to witness the miracle that had followed. He didn't think anything could surprise him anymore, but he was wrong. This was merely the beginning. The man's body disappeared. Rui could only see a haze as he began his movements, and it completely vanished in his vision as the man twisted his core to generate enough torque while driving all that momentum into his fist. The next thing Rui heard was a huge shockwave that hit him with a mild force even at a distance of more than 10 meters away, and a large thud followed by the sound of crumbling wood. The shockwave had lifted up dust and sawdust that prevented him from seeing the immediate consequences of the strike. Yet once it settled, his shock escalated. The tree trunk was reduced to bits. The man damn near pulverized that huge tree trunk with a single punch. The man turned and glanced at Rui and Alice, unperturbed. Anything else? Chapter 4, Orphanage. Lashara sighed as she finished working on the accounts of the Courtier orphanage. Money was tough this month. An orphanage had many expenditures, the most taxing of them being food. It wasn't easy to obtain enough money to feed 16 children and 6 adults. Although 5 of the 6 adults earned money, they barely made enough for everybody. This was despite the tax waivers that orphanages received from the government and the few donations that the orphanage occasionally received from benevolent rich patrons. Their monthly expenditure included food, clothes, as children were constantly growing, and with 16 of them something or the other was always outgrown every month, sanitation supplies, the discounted tax, maintenance, and several other individually small needs and indulgences that culminated in a daunting monthly expenditure. The Courier Orphanage had been founded by her 23 years ago. Back then she was the only caretaker, and she had taken in 5 children back then. Generally, families looking to adopt went to larger and more famous orphanages rather than smaller ones like her own, so the 5 children she took in had never been adopted. She raised them like her own children. Those 5 children, Alice, Karen, Deb, Myra and Kenta, grew up and decided to support the orphanage and their mother. Together they constituted the 6 adult caretakers that ran the Courier Orphanage. Lashara spent all her time at the orphanage, whereas the 5 caretakers had part-times that allowed them to sustain the orphanage. Usually they had anywhere between 14-16 children. This was their utmost limit given the orphanage's accommodation and financial capacity, as well as the caretaker-to-child ratio. Though, families preferred to adopt younger children, below the age of 1 normally, so most of the older kids remained in the orphanage. They would be home tutored in their early years by Lashara mainly. She would teach them basic law, geography, history, mathematics, and the absolute bare basics of economics and politics. She did her best to instill the foundational knowledge that all were expected to have, as well as the things all adults ought to know. Although she was no learned academic, over the span of 23 years she had become a master of teaching the basics. The ladies Alice, Myra, and Karen worked part-time in kitchens, restaurants, at wealthier residences as cooks, waitresses, maids, babysitters, and jobs of those sorts. The men Deb and Kenta worked in manual labor jobs, rickshaw pullers most of the time, albeit in winter they preferred to get into mining. Together the 5 earned a majority of the monthly income the orphanage received. Lashara loved each one of them from the bottom of her heart. Without them, she would have to shut down the orphanage, the mere thought of which made her heart ache. Things were hard, but because she had such loving children, she could overcome these tribulations. Things had gotten even harder since the orphanage took Rui in. A newborn infant required constant attention and supervision. This put an even greater burden on them, but Lashara did not regret her decision. She felt a great amount of heartbroken pity when her sister, who worked as a nurse in the hospital, informed her of a black-haired, black-eyes orphan baby who had not been accepted by even a single orphanage. Black hair and eyes were exceedingly rare and were ominous, and it is said that those born with these traits could bring great ruin or fortune to the entire world. Thankfully Lashara never bought into that nonsense, and neither did most people, but the superstitious fear of bad omens still remained. To Lashara, it was just a bunch of made-up nonsense that had no doubt made the otherwise perfectly normal and ordinary children born with these traits go through a harder life. Of course, Lashara was not blind to the fact that Rui was far from a normal child. In her eyes, he was a prodigious genius beyond fathoming. He spoke his first word at the age of 2 months, shocking all the adults around him, and his vocabulary and speech increased dramatically until he could speak like a 4-year-old even before he hit the age of 1. Furthermore, his temperament was truly unbelievable. He very rarely cried, and even then, only shedding a few tears reluctantly when he got hurt badly. He was calm and patient, something Lashara thought to be impossible in an infant. It would be quite intimidating to her if it wasn't for the fact that Rui was a truly wonderful baby. He was kind, affectionate, and above all else truly adorable. She was sure he would be a heartbreaker when he grew up. She sighed as she shut the accounts book and put aside her abacus when boom! A sudden loud noise startled her. She walked down the corridor towards the back of the orphanage where the noise had come from. Ah, the squire, I see. She peered through a window at the crumbled wood and sawdust rubble. Yet another expense, but we didn't have much of a choice. Chopping it down ourselves would take too much time and energy, and the back exit is regularly used for receiving supplies because the storage room is closest to it. A storm had knocked down a brittle dead tree, leading to all these complications. Fortunately, martial squires were quick, making their services worth every bronze coin of their service. A martial squire was one of 6 realms, or ranks, of martial artists, who were part of a union known as the Martial Union, which offered any and all services that employed martial art. The orphanage had commissioned manual labor from a martial squire, through the union, though only in rare occasions. She noticed Rui by Alice's side as she paid the squire the fees for his labor. Particularly she noticed the gaping awe and admiration he expressed at the squire. It was almost impossible to miss anyway, especially coming from a child like Rui, who was generally quite reserved and passive in his emotional expression. I wonder if he'll strive to become a martial artist. Chapter 5. Martial Art. Rui spent the rest of the day pestering each and every single adult about what he had just seen, after 8 hours of incessant interrogation. He tucked himself into his bed for the night, yet he was far too excited to ever fall asleep. It had taken him a while to understand enough to just barely satisfy his foremost layer of burning curiosity. After all, his vocabulary was still quite imperfect. He pestered the adults until he was able to comprehend their nuanced answers. It was quite tiring, but he managed to obtain answers for his most burning questions. After the rigorous interrogation, he'd spent time assimilating and organizing everything he'd learned. Martial arts, or martial art as they called it, was real. It was not only real, but it was extremely powerful too. Martial artists were extremely powerful, capable of extremely superhuman feats, like the one he had witnessed. Across the country, and perhaps even the continent, martial artists were divided into 6 realms, which were basically ranks. Martial apprentice, martial squire, martial senior, martial master, martial sage, and finally, martial transcendent. Each realm was far more powerful than the last, but none of the adults knew anything more specific than that. If a martial squire, who was only the second strongest of 6 realms, was this strong, then how much stronger were the higher ranks? He wondered with giddy excitement. This revelation was truly by far the most soul-staggering experience he had ever made. Even the shock of being reborn was tame and rather boring in comparison. He quickly dismissed these thoughts before revising the rest of what he learnt. Martial art could apparently be traced to a little over 500 years ago. Martial artists grew stronger and stronger in every country. Furthermore, their numbers increased as time passed, until the martial artist population grew large enough for associations known as martial unions formed in every country. Martial unions were basically liaisons between customers of martial art services and the martial artists themselves. It served as a connection between the demand in the consumer market for services like bodyguarding, assaults, manual labor, as well as more covert operations like sabotage, infiltration, espionage, surveillance, assassinations, etc. Even niche occupations like tutelage were within the purview of the union, according to Kenta, who once was an aspiring martial artist. The martial union was an organization with a vested interest in the propagation of martial artists, so it had taken measures to ensure there would be a healthy influx of fresh blood martial artists, such as the Martial Academy. The martial academies apparently were meritocratic institutions founded, managed, and staffed by the martial union. Not to mention, these institutions trained aspiring martial artists till the martial squire stage primarily. Furthermore, according to Depp, the academies had a hefty yearly tuition fee. After all, tutelage from martial seniors was a privilege to aspiring martial artists that would otherwise be difficult to obtain. Yet the high tuition fees were not a barrier. Thankfully, the martial union was cognizant enough to recognize that a large majority of talents would simply be buried due to their low economic class. Thus, the martial academies offered a scholarship program that allowed aspiring martial candidates to incur the fees as debt and repay the debt after they graduate from the academy. The scholarship program was essentially an investment with no guaranteed returns. After all, if a scholarship student failed to graduate, then the debt would never be repaid. But ultimately, this policy allowed the martial academies, and by extension the martial union, to maximize the number of martial artists, their highest interest and goal. The financial losses were rather trivial in comparison to the economic might of an international union. Furthermore, the scholarships were given based on merit, so the losses were minimized. The moment Rui learned about the martial academies, he had already made up his mind about his future. His motivation for it was extremely high. He couldn't wait. He would get into an academy, one way or another, scholarship or not. He had already formulated potential solutions, but he lacked far too much information to flesh them out. "What are you thinking about?" A child's voice called out to him. Rui glanced in the direction it came from. "Not much, Farian." Rui responded. Farian was one of the boys at the orphanage. Rui is thinking about martial art, isn't he? A girl beside himself smirked mischievously. He spent the whole day asking all the adults about martial art. This was Nina, one of the older girls at the orphanage. In the past 10 months, Rui had familiarized himself with all the children in the orphanage, although due to the age gap, both mental and physical, he had a harder time bonding with them as much as he would have liked to, but he did spend time with them nonetheless. Children like Farian and Nina would take more time to spend time with Rui and babysit him whenever the adults were busy to make their lives easier. "Do you want to become a martial artist, Rui?" A 13-year-old boy reading a book asked him. Rui's eyes sparkled. "I'm going to become the best," Rui declared. "Then you'll have trained hard." The boy smiled, closing his book. Martial artists train very hard to get their hands on superhuman power. Are you willing to do what it takes? I was born for it, Julian Rui replied, without a shadow of doubt or hesitation. It wasn't literal though, for he had no idea why or even how he was reborn, but he suspected that there was some reason. If there was a reason, what other reason could there be? Then we'll support you to the best of our ability, Rui. Julian walked over and lifted Rui into a hug. Thanks, Rui replied. Julian was a bright child. Although he wasn't freakishly prodigious like Rui, he was a quiet and intelligent child who spent his time absorbed in books of all sorts, anything he could get his hands on. Rui was impressed by his maturity despite his age, among other things. The children chatted more until Depp told them all to put out the lights and go to sleep. To Rui's surprise, he fell asleep quickly. He was quite exhausted after a whole day of excitement. Chapter 6, Foundations. Alright, let's begin, Farian said, glancing at Rui. Rui nodded. It had been 7 years since Rui had been reborn in this world. Ever since he learned about martial art and the academy, he'd already begun preparing for them, doing everything he possibly could. The minimum age necessary to enroll into the academy was 13, adolescence. As for his preparation, he had been unable to gather much specific information. The martial academies kept a bit of a tight lid on the nature of the entrance exam. However, there were simple deductions to be made based on the available information at hand. For starters, the entrance exam, being open to only ages between 13 and 18, implied that the martial arts skill level requirements of the exam were not too onerous. 13-18 was a very young age group. It was simply impossible for an overwhelming majority of adolescents of this age group to be proficient in martial art. After all, hiring a long-term tutor from the union was very expensive, something only the rich could afford, and even then, they would not be able to master any more than the foundations. However, considering the age limit being 18, it could be inferred that the exam would not be centered around martial proficiency. That left only a few possibilities. Thankfully, Rui was a former martial art and combat sport researcher. He was well aware of the predictors and determinant variables of a successful fighting career. It wasn't even that difficult to figure out, really. The two biggest predictors of success were talent and drive. Talent in the context of martial art would mean the measure of innate, natural physical and performance attributes. This would include health, physical attributes like raw strength, speed, agility, reflexes, durability, flexibility, and stamina, as well as performative capabilities like balance, analysis and judgment, body-eye coordination, alertness, etc. While these could most certainly be trained even within the window of 13 and 18, he was certain the impact of training would not be to the degree that experienced martial art trainers of academy would be unable to evaluate raw talent. Rui was relatively certain he was not talented, unfortunately. His health and physical attributes were just barely average. He wasn't gifted with a godly body with unparalleled physical prowess, but he wasn't crippled with a severe chronic disease either like in his last life. He was just average in terms of talent. The problem was his performative attributes. He was rather bad in this area. And there was mainly one reason for this. For starters, there was the mismatch between his mind and body. His mind had grown extremely accustomed to his former body on Earth. He was lean, thin, and quite tall with a weak physique. The physical attributes/mass distribution of his previous body were drastically different from that of his current body. His mind constantly treated his body like it was his old one and not his new one. This was because of muscle memory. Furthermore, his mind was that of an adult, and despite the developing brain of his young body, it was extremely difficult to completely erase 59 years of ingrained muscle memory in order to make way for new muscle memory for his new body. Certainly wouldn't happen anytime soon. That was why he had been training his performative attributes as much as possible so that they could from go bad to, at the very least, average, ideally as high as possible. He had begun training his balance and body-eye coordination, alertness as much as possible outside of basic physical training. It was the middle of the winter. Rui had gathered Farian, Horatio and Mika, 3 adults, to the frozen lake to help him with balance training. He was standing on the frozen river 1 meter away from the bank. The training was simple: playing catch. The 3 boys would stand on land and play catch with Rui. They would throw balls at him one at a time. Rui was to catch the ball perfectly on slippery ice and toss it back, all without slipping or falling. There was almost no friction between his boot and the ice, meaning if his center of gravity was not directly under the support of his legs, he would slip and fall. Initially, Rui's sense of balance was so bad that he could barely stand in one place without falling, and most certainly couldn't think about moving around on the ice. It was only after 2 years of training that his sense of balance improved enough that he could begin playing catch, which required far greater balance, since Rui would need to catch the ball and stop its momentum without ever losing balance, and throw it back without shifting his center of gravity. Yeah, I'm ready. Rui responded to Farian. Farian nodded before throwing a ball at him, before Rui got caught and returned it. Horatio and Micah followed one after the another, throwing balls at Rui from different directions. It was a whole 1 minute of rapid back and forths before Rui slipped and fell on his ass. That was your longest record so far. Micah noted. Rui nodded. All right, let's continue. Horatio sighed. Are you sure this is worth all the effort? You're not cut out for martial art, you know. It's especially a waste of your genius-level intellect. You could become a scholar like Julian, did you know? I already told you, I'm not interested in becoming a scholar. I'll become a martial artist or nothing at all. Yes, yes. He sighed. Not everyone thought Rui's ambition was a good idea, of course. It was not easy to become a martial artist, although a great many people aspired to become one. Ultimately, a whopping 99% of them failed to become martial squires. It was an extremely difficult ambition to fulfill. Rui breathed deeply, readying himself. He couldn't do it in his previous life, but this time for sure he would become a martial artist. Continue. Chapter 7, World. Rui burped, putting down his bowl and patting his inflated stomach. That's bad manners, Rui. Ashara gently reprimanded him. My bad, I'm just completely full. He apologized, before getting up. He washed his used utensils and vessels and put it in the cupboard. Thanks for the delicious dinner, I love steak. Myra smirked from across the kitchen. I knew you would be absolutely famished after that ice balance training you always do in the winters. Today we managed to get some good steak at a low price. Myra was the head cook of the orphanage. She was in charge of all matter related to the kitchen. Sweet, do you need help with the rest of the utensils? Rui sked. Nah, there isn't much left. You must be tired, so why don't you get some sleep? All right, thanks, good night. Good night. He headed towards the study before picking up a book. The study had numerous books on various subjects that Lashara would refer to while teaching. From these books Rui had managed to learn about the world he was reborn in. Thankfully he'd spent the last 6 years learning the script to read and write, and he had become very proficient with language, far more so than a normal 7-year-old. He'd read up on history, geography, and civics with some guidance from Lashara to answer some of the questions he had had for a long time. The country he was born in was known as the Kandria Empire, named after the royal Kandrian family whose ancestor founded the empire. The country bordered the Namgung Ocean. It was long and narrow in shape, extending from north to south, with nearly half of the borders facing the ocean. The other half was partially bordered by the 3 closest countries, the Sekigahara Confederate to its south, Republic of Gordo to its north, and Britannia Empire to its west, and large forests that occupied the gaps between the countries. Another important piece of information he had gotten his hands on was that the Kandrian Empire paid annual tributes to all 3 of its neighboring nations, for some reason. Unfortunately, the exact details of the international deliberations was not exactly well known. All 4 nations were part of the Panama continent, the one and only known continent on planet Gaia. The Panama continent was gigantic, littered with nearly 100 countries of all sorts, with various cultures, socio-economic structures and governments. Strangely enough, although each country had its own language, there was an international common language known as Sanskrit, created and propagated by the countries to facilitate greater international trade in accordance to the Panama Linguistic Treaty ratified 80 years ago. The treaty was highly effective, as the language barrier was the greatest barrier between connections and exchanges. I've only learnt the Kandrian dialect, though, Rui noted. Another curious piece of information he learned about was that the fauna and flora of the Panama continent was, frankly, ridiculous. There were plants with all kinds of exotic substances that served as raw materials and ingredients in various types of products, the most prominent application being potions. Potions granted incredible effects such as healing, stamina recovery, temporary mental and physical augmentation of various sorts. These potions allowed ordinary humans to match the superhuman prowess of even martial artists. This was something Rui found absurd when he learned, but that wasn't even everything. The fauna was even more bizarre. For one, there were intelligent species outside of humanity. This came as a shock to someone from Earth, where only one known intelligent species existed. The fauna was much less restrained and resembled the prehistoric age of dinosaurs. Despite nearly 100 nations established on the Panama continent, roughly 35% of the continent's land was uncolonized natural habitats that was occupied by incredible species with immense power. One of the reasons humanity had not yet completely colonized the Panama was because they simply could not. The animal species were no pushovers. They were able to easily match the humans' paltry applications of gunpowder, potions, and large-scale siege weapons. It could be said that they would have long hunted humanity to oblivion if not for the existence of martial artists. A significant portion of the commissions that the martial unions of the Panama continent was related to the beasts, one way or another. Rui was incredibly intrigued by these strange and fantastical species, but they weren't immediately relevant to him at the moment. He was more concerned with things that affected him more immediately. Within the Kandrian Empire, Rui lived in the northernmost region with the harshest winters, Mancha. Sai, to land into the region of the harshest weather of all the 11 states. Rui shook his head. He shouldn't think this way. He was blessed with a loving family in the courtier orphanage in this region. Kandria had a capitalistic free market, and as expected there was a great economic divide between people. Its governmental system was a monarchy, as he would expect from nations in this age of development. The Kandrian emperor had many wives and even more children. Each one of them was a potential heir to the throne. Apparently, it was Kandrian protocol for the emperor to test all the princes and princesses in a manner of his own discretion, before declaring one of them as the emperor or empress when his life was coming to an end. Apparently, the current emperor Rael Vi Kandria was already quite old, and the royal selection would most certainly occur sooner or later. Rui wasn't well aware of the nuances of Kandrian politics, and, frankly, he would rather not be involved at all if he could avoid it. The royal selection sounded like a chaotic mess of a phenomenon. Even on Earth he merely kept himself informed on the state of affairs in a superficial manner, and for the most part ignored politics. He would probably care even less once he became martial artist, not getting involved at all, directly or indirectly. Or at least, so he hoped. Chapter 8. Kidnap. The information he was most concerned about was that of the Kandrian martial academies. It turned out there were 16 academies in the country. One of them was located in Mancha. Rui intended to aim for the Manchan branch. In the past 6 years he had deigned to do a more thorough investigation into the entrance exam. However, the Martial Academy was quite secretive about its entrance exams. The union did not want every applicant to be able to prepare targeted solutions that made their job of evaluating their talent and drive more difficult. They went so far as to almost completely change the exam every year, so as to diminish the impact of the leaked information from recalcitrant failed applicants every year. The only thing Rui learned was that there were multiple rounds each year and the exam invigilators changed each year as well. The difficulty of the exams was exceedingly high. Furthermore, it was said that a small number of applicants died every year, while a greater proportion were greatly hurt. This was unexpected when I learned about it. I was hoping to make targeted training regimes that could allow me to overcome these tests. Rui sighed. Having dedicated his life to research into martial arts and combat sports, Rui was an expert in evaluating the physical and performative attributes necessary for any particular activity, and setting up targeted training regimes that would most efficiently facilitate the growth of the athlete's ability to complete said physical activity. I'll just have to stick to what I'm already doing, I guess. He mused. Rui, it's time to sleep, Lashara said, standing at the doorway. All right, Mom, Rui replied. All the children treated Lashara as their mother. Rui was no different. All of them had been raised by her. She was indeed a mother-like figure to all of them, the adults included. Later on, having changed into the medieval equivalent of pajamas, he lay in bed contemplating what he ought to do tomorrow. Cardio early in the mornings, 1 hour. Then 20 reps of squats, crunches, push-ups, pull-ups, and chest dips, 3 reps of plank variations, all until lunch. Rest, followed by balance training at the lake till evening, followed by basic body conditioning and tempering. This was actually a relatively simple and mild training regime, but that was because he was only 7 years old. His body was still growing, especially his bones. Stressing them too much would be quite detrimental in the long run. He planned to increase his exercise load as he got older. I should be decently well built by the time I'm done. The next day, he followed through with his early morning jog. He would generally begin at the orphanage jog to the city and come back before the rush hour begins, but today he was a bit late, so he was navigating through the earliest bustle of the day. In one hand he had a carry bag with the milk that Myra had requested him to purchase from the market. Tisk, it's already so busy, Rui tutted as he was forced to slow down. He couldn't really just jog past a crowd of adults twice as large as him. He was forced to take a detour through an alley and skip through the crowd. I didn't want to break my run, maybe I should jog a little extra, but Myra did say she wanted the milk, so He suddenly felt 2 arms grabbing around him, one to prevent him from screaming and the other to carry him away. Heh, black hair and black eyes? That's rare, this one can sell for a fortune. He heard a burly voice. Oh, he even has some change, good bonus, he said as he scoured through Rui's pocket. Fuck, I'm actually being kidnapped. Rui began to panic. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do as the man began carrying him away. I need to get away, but his grip is too strong. Rui began to brainstorm. Brute force was out of the question. He needed the man to loosen his grip, otherwise he would have no chance of escaping. Think, how do I create an opportunity to escape? He wasn't sure. The man's burly hand was wrapped tightly over his mouth and nose to prevent him from making noise. But that gave him an idea. He decided to let his body go slack, acting as if he'd suffocated. Tisk. The man put Rui down for a second to take a good look to ensure his goods was all right. Yet just as he did, Rui jammed his thumb into his kidnapper's eyes and got up to run away as far as he could, even as the man screamed in pain, cradling his eye. The pain of having his eye jabbed brought the man to a halt, buying Rui only a few seconds of time. The man got up quickly and chased after Rui with a closed eye. I just need to reach a populated area. He won't get away with a public child crime. Unfortunately, he couldn't get back to the market the way he came. The burly man was in the way and he most certainly would have been caught. He just needed to reach people, but unfortunately, he'd reached a dead end instead. Fuck, I need to go. Oh no, heh. Too bad you couldn't get away, little boy. The man threw Rui a disgusting smile. In that moment Rui felt despair and true fear. His legs began to shake and he almost peed himself. Rui forced himself to take a fighting stance, but the man walked over and, ignoring Rui's meager struggles, grabbed Rui by the neck, forcing him down. Rui thought about screaming, but when he opened his mouth, nothing came out. Let's have you choke for real, he whispered even as his grin grew wider. Rui froze in terror. He's going to kill me. Rui panicked. His heart was beating hard and fast, struggling to give Rui the power he needed, but Rui was too afraid to use it. It's no use, I'm too weak. He knew this, giving up. I'm not just weak, I'm pathetic. Just as his vision was turning red, the man's grip slacked and his arms let go of his neck, and Rui's body contorted as he gasped and inhaled for air, before turning around. What the fuck just happened? What he saw shocked him. The man was dead, lying on the ground. What was even more shocking was the cause of death. The top of his head was dented and broken in. There was another man standing behind him with a fist midair. To attempt to snuff the life of an innocent child is the greatest of sins one can commit, the man said, scorning at the corpse. His eyes turned to Rui. Are you all right, my child? Chapter 9. Naive. He was naive. He had underestimated what it meant to be a warrior. This wasn't a movie or an anime, this was real life. He would have died on the spot if his savior was too late. Rui thought he could just train and become a warrior, but he had severely underestimated the temperament and resolve needed to fight with his life on the line. How could he, a former denizen of the 21st century, understand? He had never fought in his life, ever. He didn't understand just how strong the primal fear of death was ingrained into one's soul. Martial artists weren't decorative and aesthetical artists whose jobs were to look cool. They were warriors, assassins, protectors, hunters, pioneers. They were people who fought every day with their lives on the line. They tread up the martial path knowing that every step could very easily be their last. Did he possess such resolve? That day had made the answer clear. He did not. He was unworthy of being a warrior, a martial artist. You're wrong, said the man who saved him. He walked over and sat beside him, patting his head. His gesture was warm and gentle, but his hand was heavy and rough, like a boulder. Kid, you want to be a martial artist, correct? Rui nodded. He was still choked with emotions. Of course you do. There is no other reason a kid your age would put yourself through the training that you have. He noted. Do you think yourself unworthy of being a warrior because of the fear and despair you felt? It was as if the man could read Rui's heart. Rui nodded reluctantly. The man smiled in response. Indeed, you were quite pathetic, not gonna lie. You quivered in fear and despair as you were pushed into the ground. The words tore a hole in Rui's heart. But whether or not you're worthy of being a warrior, my child, depends on what you do from here on out. He turned to Rui, who met his gaze in return. There isn't a single soul who hasn't felt crippling fear and despair. Even the strongest of martial artists who can split the earth with a finger have experienced what you have. What separates the strong from the weak is whether or not one overcomes that fear and strives forward. Rui clenched his fists and gritted his teeth. Tell me, boy, will you succumb to your fear? Never again. Rui swore even as tears of frustration, shame and anger poured out of his eyes. Every muscle in his body went taut. He felt as if every cell in his body stood united as he ingrained his oath into each and every single one of them. I will never let fear and despair get the best of me again. The man he smiled as he glanced at the fire in the young boy's eyes. Rui got up and bowed deeply to the man. Thank you for saving my life. I'm just doing my duty. The man got up, patted Rui's head one last time and walked away. Stay safe, boy. I'd like to see you become a warrior. You have what it takes. Rui nodded, before bowing down one last time. He made his way to the market, before returning down the path home. I forgot to ask his name. He ran into Farian on the way back home, explaining what had happened, leaving Farian in shock. Things only got worse when he reached back home. All the adult caretakers would not stop fawning over him, and constantly patting and hugging him, partially to reaffirm his well-being and also to soothe their anxiety. Lashara went so far as to almost ban him from leaving the orphanage out of paranoia, but he managed to get her to change her mind about that, albeit not completely. Rui had to stay within the vicinity of the orphanage, or be under supervision if he wanted to go further. He had no choice but to acquiesce with great reluctance. He'd decided to skip the training for the rest of the day and hang out with his brothers and sisters. He wanted a change of pace. "Have you finally decided to join us in playing cards, Rui?" Horatio asked as he made space for Rui. In the past 7 years he'd forged unbreakable bonds with each of the orphanage members. He enjoyed spending time with the grumpy Fardian, the mischievous Nina, the pragmatic Horatio, the reserved Micah, and the intelligent Julian. When Rui first joined the orphanage, the adults ignored the silly superstition surrounding his hair and eyes, and children quickly followed suit largely due to their ignorance, expressing adoration about how cute he was. The past 7 years had caused him to develop a great amount of affection for each of them, and the orphanage as a whole. Almost to the point he'd rather stay with them than leave to become a martial artist. Almost, but still not enough, he mused. His renewed will and determination after that morning's incident would not allow him to not become a martial artist. He just felt a tinge of sadness that it would eventually drive him away from his family. The academy not only took care of housing and food, but mandated its students to stay in the academy dormitories. The martial path was one that required discipline, which could only be fully enforced if the academy regulated the students' lives from dawn to dusk. Even once he graduated, he suspected he would have to spend long hours, days and maybe even weeks away from his family. He would most certainly grow a little distant from them, it was inevitable. Although he would always love them, prolonged periods of separation would likely dampen his emotions. He was not a very social person. Even in his previous life, his parents died early, and since then he had never forged a single significant relationship or even friendship. "I'll make the most of these times, then for the next 6 years then I'll have to leave them." It was a shame to Rui. He quickly shook away these thoughts before getting invested in the game. Chapter 10, Martial Exam. Have you taken your identification? Yes. Have you taken some energy drinks? Yes. Have you double-checked the timings? Yes. Have you enough, Mom? I have everything in place, don't worry. Rui reprimanded exasperatedly. Ashara was notoriously overprotective. The martial entrance exam was notoriously difficult and dangerous. Ashara had warned Rui over and over that it could be disastrous, but she knew Rui had been preparing for this day for a long time. His resolve was quite unshakable. She knew her words would have no effect. Rather than antagonizing him and earn his ire, she decided to give him her blessings. 6 years had passed since the kidnapping incident. Rui was now 13 years old. The time for the martial arts entrance exam had come. It was quite unnerving to Rui, even though he had been mentally preparing himself for this day for a long time. No, it was because he'd been preparing for this day for a long time that he was nervous. He breathed deeply, trying to calm his racing heart down as he prepared his pouch with some basic essentials. "Let me travel with you there, Rui." Julian smiled. He had managed to graduate from the Kandrian Institute of Sciences and was accepted into the institute as an apprentice scholar under a prestigious scholar in the Research and Development Department. "Thanks." Rui nodded. Julian had always been a calming influence. He was a true genius too, unlike Rui. Lasharda hugged him one last time and kissed him on the head. "Be safe, don't push yourself too far, okay?" she told him. A tinge of anxiety rippled across her face. "Yeah, don't worry, Mom. I'll be fine." After receiving well wishes from the whole of the courtier orphanage, he bid them farewell and set out with Julian on a rickshaw. "Nervous?" "Surprisingly not as much as just a while ago. Being supported by my family puts me at ease, even though the significance or difficulty of the exam hasn't changed at all." "I'm glad to hear that." Julian smiled. "I'm going to be honest with you. I truly never did expect that your drive to become a martial artist would be this strong." Rui didn't know how to respond. Children undergo a lot of phases as they grow. This is universally true for almost everybody. I say almost true, because I've only ever come across one exception. Julian turned to Rui with scrutinizing eyes. "Born with hitherto unheard of prodigious, genius-level intelligence, having mastered 2 languages, mathematics, and sciences at an extraordinarily young age, yet you've never changed at all, Rui." Julian continued. "It's pretty absurd. Your temperament was also unchanging and mature well beyond your age. Your cognitive capabilities only grew exponentially sharper as you grew older." Rui knew what he was talking about. A human being's brain stopped developing at the age of 25. This was the age at which their cognitive capabilities reached a peak. Rui, however, inherited the cognitive capabilities of his previous brain stacked on top of the growing cognition of his adolescent brain. It was as if he possessed the sum of the IQs of both John Falcon and Rui Courtier. This was one of the biggest advantages of being reborn with your mind intact. His already grown mind received the advantage of growing even more for a second time. All of this data points to the conclusion that you're an adult in a child's body, Julian continued. Rui turned his head and met his gaze, before smirking. You don't actually believe that, do you? No. Julian shrugged, smiling. It's not impossible, nothing is, but it's too absurd. Heh. Inwardly Rui sweating. He had no idea why he was reincarnated, though he suspected there was a reason behind it. He was pretty scared that his secret would come out when Julian began talking about Rui. To think that this guy had been scrutinizing and analyzing Rui for the past 13 years and correctly hypothesized the actual truth, as expected of an actual genius. They bantered for a long time until the rickshaw had reached its destination. Well then, good luck Rui. I'll be heading to the KIS from here. Thanks Julian, goodbye. Oh, one last thing. Rui turned to face Julian as he got off. Even if you were someone else reborn in a child's body, I would still love you as my brother. Julian smiled warmly. Go on Rui, fulfill your dream. Rui smiled back. I sure as hell will. And with that, the two brothers split paths. Rui turned to face the mansion branch of the Kandrian Martial Academy. There are many rickshaws, and even many chariots littered outside the academy. There were many thousands of adolescent boys and even a decent proportion of girls accumulating inside the gigantic facility. Gigantic was an understatement. The only reason he wasn't too shocked was because he had demanded to see the academy at least once before. Still, it was an incredible sight. Just the mere sight of it forcefully inspired ambition from within one's heart. This is it. The Kandrian Martial Academy was a multi-section set of facilities that revolved around one primary facility that served as the main facility for training. It was fortified by a huge wall made from stones and cement that circled around the academy for many kilometers on end. The sheer prestige of this academy alone drove more than 1 million aspiring martial artists to apply for the entrance exam. As Rui entered the academy, having passed the huge gates after showing his ID to the gate security, he took a good look at the competitors, who were heading towards the designated exam center. They're almost all older than me. Rui noted. Most of the adolescents taking the exam seemed to be 16 and above. I guess it's somewhat rare for a 13-year-old to participate. Rui said, as he received a numbered tag upon reaching the facility, serving as his applicant ID. The exam center was even bigger than one would think from afar. Within the facility was a huge crowd of applicants. The mood was tense, although there were martial artists serving as assistant invigilators to prevent the outbreak of violence. Just standing in the room with thousands of others put faint pressure on Rui. A cursory glance at the crowd revealed a lot of information about his competition. Most of them have trained their body, though not as much as I have. Yet a lot of them are inherently physically superior to I am. I'm only making up for a lack of talent compared to the strongest applicants. The age gap definitely favors them significantly too. Rui smiled. Not that I give a fuck, I'm going to crack this exam no matter what. Chapter 11. First round. Just then, a strong, loud voice echoed across the facility from atop the stage near the opposite end of the room to the entrance. Welcome to the 106th annual entrance exam of the Martial Academy. A man who looked to be in his 50s spoke. He had a long salt and pepper beard and a bald head. He wore luxurious robes over a simple martial art uniform that spoke to his position within the academy. The most distinctive feature about him was the most intangible one, the weight of his presence. Rui could feel it. Every single applicant could feel it. They all even realized they experienced the same pressure when everyone began stiffening up or showing other signs of anxiety, fear and discomfort. He's not even doing anything special. Rui smiled nervously as he began sweating. He just gave the most generic and simple welcome. I am Master Aronian, a martial master and the headmaster of the Kandrian Martial Academy. I will also be serving as your head examiner and invigilator. He continued, ignoring the applicants' reactions. So this is a martial master? Incredible, this is fucking amazing. Rui grew more and more excited. How could he not? The man was more hundreds of meters away and his lungs were powerful enough to talk loudly enough without any aid. He was that far away, yet his presence alone was so heavy that Rui felt as if he was staring a bloodthirsty, man-eating tiger in the eyes point blank. He could kill us all in under a second, if he wanted. Rui's instincts told him. The exam will have 3 rounds. Each of the 3 rounds will require you to complete 1 or more tasks. The exact conditions and stipulations of passing and failure may be left to the discretion of the individual invigilators evaluating your performance, for the 3rd round particularly. The first round and second round, however, are objective. So, the criteria for passing the third round is not objective. That may make things tricky. Different invigilators may measure your capabilities differently, but why is the first and second round different? We will begin the first round shortly, Master Aronian said, raising his hand. Immediately, thousands of martial artists entered the facility and got onto the stage with boxes, followed by 100 distinguished-looking martial artists. They have a heavy presence, though not as severe as that of Master Aronian. Martial seniors maybe. It makes sense, Master Aronian isn't going to administer the test personally. We applicants are not worth his time. Once the 100 seniors had finished spreading out on the gigantic stage and their assistants finished setting up a simple-looking table with boxes behind them and railing leading down the steps from them, Master Aronian continued. The test will now begin. Within each of the large boxes placed on the table are the passes for the second round of the exam. Your objective is very simple. You must walk over to the martial senior standing in front of each box, shake their hand and request them for a pass, all rapidly within 10 seconds. Master Aronian paused for a second, indulging himself in a smile. Those who can complete the aforementioned objective will receive a pass to the second round. Those who cannot will irrevocably fail the first round as well as the exam altogether. Good luck. He walked away, having completed his duty. Harui was gobsmacked. He could sense that each and every single applicant save a small minority were just as confused as he was. He, like a lot of others, decided to wait it out and see what happened. There was obviously more to this than met the eye. Rui watched with great scrutiny as the first applicant walked up the stairs to the stage, through the railings. But just as he reached the stage, he froze. Why did he stop? Rui glanced at the martial senior that the applicant was facing before realizing what had happened. Bloodlust. Rui sensed the emotion the powerful senior was practically radiating. In fact, all the seniors had begun doing just that. The applicants at the front of the queue had frozen in fear, unable to approach the martial senior. 10 seconds later, the martial squires assisting the martial senior began declaring applicants' failures. Applicant 5 before, failed. Applicant 10,756, failed. Applicant 65,784, failed. Applicant 45,786, failed. Applicant 37, failed. I see. I get it now. Rui realized. The first round was a test of fortitude and resolve. Martial seniors were exploiting evolutionary neurology and psychology to evaluate the applicants. All sentient life had evolved to evaluate danger, risks, and threat. This was an evolutionary psychogenetic trait that allowed for species and ecosystems to survive. It was a well-documented phenomenon of evolutionary biology in his previous life. This included even the smallest of animals like insects to the most powerful of dragons and phoenixes that existed in this world. All of them were able to evaluate danger subconsciously from observation and intuition. Based on how high the danger was evaluated to be subconsciously, their minds would experience a proportional amount of fear. The first round of the exam utilized this neuropsychological phenomenon in testing the applicants. The seniors were not literally radiating some magical energy field that induced fear, they were merely exploiting the candidate's instinctual, subconscious danger evaluation to induce crippling fear in the applicants. This was a piece of cake for the martial seniors, considering the applicants were basically kids. In fact, they even held back their bloodlust and didn't seem to go overboard. They needed to see how far each applicant could be pushed. Specifically, they're testing our resolve and our determination. 1 million applicants applied every year, each of them was driven by different motivations. Glory, money, prestige, ambition, power, duty, etc. The first round tested the strength of the applicant's determination to become a martial artist. The martial journey was an incredibly arduous and dangerous journey. If the applicants could not overcome this simple obstacle, they were wholly unfit to become martial artists. They would fail to reach even the martial squire stage. I've undergone this test before. Rui remembered. The kidnapping incident was somewhat similar to this test, and he failed that test miserably. He'd sworn he never would fail ever again. This time for sure. Chapter 12, I will. Applicant 11,234, Kane Arankar, pass. Rui heard, as he took a good look at the first applicant to pass the test and head out the exit with a pass. To his surprise, the kid was short, about as short as him. Whoa, to think a kid my age would pass this test. Rui noted, impressed. He decided to wait his turn until the queue shortened and most of the applicants failed. To think the first round alone would be this cutthroat. Rui mused, though it was to be expected to some degree. More than 1 million applicants applied to the entrance exam every year on average. There were only 16 institutes with what should be around a carrying and training capacity of no more than 1,000 or 2 each. If the already existing students were factored in, that would yield an acceptance rate of around 1%, meaning the 3 rounds of the exam had to somehow whittle away 99% of all applicants. With that stipulation in mind, this brutal filtering made a lot of sense. That also means that each martial artist was effectively the most talented as well as the most determined and resolved of their generation. Rui's respect and admiration for martial artists went up. He quietly observed the ongoing ordeal for quite a while, specifically observing those who passed the test. He was quite a distance, so he wasn't able to discern their characteristics, but in general they had an air of solidity in them. They were people who had enough determination to overcome their primal fear of death. The question is whether I'll join them or not, Rui wondered. Yet for some strange reason he wasn't as nervous as he was when he'd woken up that morning. Weird, I was nervous back at the orphanage, but I feel serene now. Shouldn't it be the other way around? The first round will be ending soon. We urge those who haven't attempted the round yet to do so before the time limit ends. You will not be allowed to appear for the round once the time is up. That prompted Rui forward. He saw multiple empty queues as all the riffraff left with deflated spirits. Maybe it's because I know? He walked forward nonchalantly, climbing the stairs step by step, maintaining eye contact with the senior who would be evaluating his performance. Once he reached the top of the stairs, he stopped. He felt as if the air was prickling his skin, urging him to stop. He felt as if the ground had begun to incline upwards, denying him entry. He felt as if the world itself barricaded his path forward while instinctual fear shackled him back. What a horrifying feeling. So this is the bloodlust of a senior. It's millions, if not billions of times scarier than the man who nearly choked me to death. He looked down at his quivering fingers. It was almost as if his body had begun fearing it of its own volition. He clenched his fists, as if to forcefully imbue courage in them, before walking forward at a steady pace. Maybe it's because I know, he reached the senior, that this isn't enough to curb me. He glared at the senior with defiance, even as his jaw clattered. His legs felt like they were turning to jelly. His limbs felt like an electric current ran through them. But he pushed forward, going so far as to crush his tongue to combat the fear. I will become a martial artist. Before bowing to show respect, defiance could be tolerated, but disrespect would not. Rising back up, he calmed down as his expression returned to neutral. Senior, may I have a pass to the second round? The man stared deeply into Rui's pitch-black eyes, before breaking into a smile. Of course, he acquiesced, handing Rui a piece of paper that, written on it, was a declaration of his right to appear for the second round of the 106th Kandrian Martial Academy entrance exam. Applicant 30,947, Rui Courtier, pass. With that, Rui made his way to the exit at the end of the stage, heading down the path indicated by signs until he reached a facility. Within it, of course, were the applicants who passed the first round. There's still like a few thousand of them, Rui inwardly tutted. He'd hoped there would be fewer, resulting in lesser competition. He knew that the real competition would start from here. All the people who made it to the second round were built different from the wannabes. Everyone in the room eyed each other, knowing exactly this. Rui drew a fair bit of attention himself because of his youth and his pitch-black hair and eyes. Though he didn't care too much, it was something he had long grown used to. The training room they were in was rather strange. It was basically a giant hemisphere. There were also several panels located all across the hemisphere, as if they were meant to serve as hatches from which things could be dropped into the training facility. That's eerie. The training hall confused him because he couldn't understand why it had such strange architecture. It couldn't be easy to engineer and construct a facility with such a strange shape. It was also rather inconvenient in a variety of ways since it covered a lot of area on the ground, but the net volume of the building was rather low in comparison to other conventional multi-story buildings. So why on earth would the Academy bother going out of its way to construct something of this sort? It probably has something to do with the exam, Rui suspected, though he wasn't entirely sure. If this was the case though, there were multiple possible reasons for architecture he could come up with. Suddenly Rui felt a familiar pressure interrupting his thoughts. He knew who it was before even confirming with his own eyes. Congratulations on passing the first round of the entrance exam, Master Aronian said, walking towards the applicants. The fact that you stand here before me is proof that within each one of you lies a burning desire to become a martial artist. Yet that is not enough. Will cannot alter your fate all by itself, it needs power. You need power. The only question I have for each one of you is, his eyes sharpened. Do you have power? His tone weighed on them. The answer to that question would decide the outcome of the exam. Chapter 13. Bouncing Slimes. The second round will soon begin. Even as he said that, Rui could see assistants bringing out thousands of boxes. Something to do with the second round, no doubt. Rui noted as they finished bringing everything they needed seemingly. Your performance in the second round will be graded by points. Master Aronian continued. Those of you whose number of points are lower than that of the average will fail this round. As for the actual test itself, all of you will be locked in this training hall with bouncing slimes. Bouncing slimes are a species of slimes that hunt animals, humans included, in dungeons by slamming into them repeatedly by bouncing in enclosed spaces. These slimes will be released in here with all of you, and they will hunt to kill you. Blocking or parrying a slime while incurring minimal damage will earn you 1 point, dodging a slime will earn you 2 points, and killing a slime will earn you 5 points. This is not what I expected. I pictured a more straightforward testing of physical and performative attributes. There is more important information and rules, so please pay attention. Firstly, the number of slimes in the training room at any point in time will be maintained at 100. That's a fuck ton. Secondly, you are prohibited from entering a 2-meter radius of your fellow applicants. Every violation of this rule will cost you 5 points. Makes sense, it prohibits uncontrolled violence between the applicants. Thirdly, you will be required to wear a special weighted suit at all times. Master Aronian explained as the assistants took out said suits from the boxes and began offering them to the applicants. These suits are quite heavy and will strain and hinder your body, allowing us to evaluate your capability more objectively. The weight in these suits come from an extremely dense and heavy liquid present in the outer layer of the suit. You will not be allowed to remove these suits during the exam. Master Aronian warned. Wait, so we have to block and dodge 100 bouncing slimes that hunt humans while wearing these heavy suits? Rui was stunned. Yet even as fear crept into his heart, a nervous smile broke onto his face. Fourthly, you may not be within 10 meters of the walls of this exam center. Tisk, that kills an obvious strategy. And the final and most important rule, once the second round begins, it will stop only after the first applicant among you dies. All the applicants in the room froze, Rui included. Master Aronian just increased the stakes. Even though the probability of them being the one to die was low, just knowing that one of them would inevitably die made the air macabre. All of you will be required to sign a consent form in order to appear for this round and the next. You will be unable to withdraw from the exam once it has begun, so please make up your minds carefully. Good luck. The second round will begin in half an hour. So this is why the exam is known to kill a few applicants every year. Rui realized. This year, at least 16 applicants will die because each of the 16 branches of the Kandrian Martial Academy is holding the exam. I'm going to have to give this round my absolute best. As Rui put on his suit, he noted how strange the fabric was. Extremely elastic, yet it doesn't exert a high restorative spring force despite large amounts of strain and its thickness. I don't think even Earth had such a remarkable material. Every substance had something called a Young's modulus. It was a property that described how much stress was needed to strain a certain material or substance. The suits that were provided had an exceptionally low modulus, allowing to be stretched with great ease. After he and many other applicants put the suit on, one of the assistant invigilators inserted something into the suit from an opening in the back that instantly added great weight to the suit while simultaneously began shifting its center of mass. The drastic shifts in center of mass and gravity made both Rui and most other contestants fall, losing their balance. I see. This isn't just meant to hinder our movements, it's meant to hinder our balance as well. Master Aronian had mentioned that the extra weight came from an extremely dense liquid in the outer layer of the suit. Liquids did not have a defined shape allowing them to flow within the suit every time Rui tilted it. Furthermore, Rui's movements were hindered by the inertia of the liquid, reducing his agility. This is no joke, this will be quite difficult to handle. Rui gritted. His balance wasn't bad, but with a dense liquid flowing around inside the suit, he had a hard time getting his bearing. He spent the remaining 20 minutes testing how much the suit hindered his movements. It deviates my movements roughly 20%. Looking around, he noticed that the other applicants didn't have an easy time adapting to the suit. Most of them had to perform every movement with caution. It seems they're doing their best to get used to its feel as quickly as possible before the exam begins. How crude. He tutted. Rui had already prepared a set of tactics to make the most efficient use of his body under the current circumstances. He'd made use of the rotational and fluid dynamics he learned thoroughly in his last life. Because of the extra torque caused by uneven distribution of the liquid every time I bend, I need to reduce the degree to which I tilt or bend my body. I've already determined that my legs can't handle full body motions due to the pre-existing torque of my body. In addition to the extra torque caused by the liquid, I need to reduce the net torque acting on my body by ensuring I don't tilt or bend as much as I normally do. Doing this will keep the balance and distribution of liquid in the suit even and uniform. This was a very fancy and technical way of saying, I'll trip if I bend too much, so I should stay steady. This might sound like common sense, but the difference was that Rui had determined at exactly what angle of tilting and bending did the torque become too much. Due to his physics background, he could clearly estimate and extrapolate whether or not a certain maneuver was safe and what the likelihood of losing his balance was. I'm not talented. I wasn't born with great strength, speed, or durability, or exceptional balance and flexibility or body-eye coordination, but I have the wealth of knowledge of a lifetime and a mind growing past its ordinary limits. I won't succumb to this challenge. Chapter 14. Pandemonium. The assistant invigilators quickly vacated the room, leaving the applicants alone. All of them had been informed the exam would begin the moment the doors shut closed. They'd maintained several meters distance from each other with their guards up and their alertness at max, eyeing the gigantic dome ceilings and its many closed hatches. The tension was palpable. Everyone knew that the carelessness could end up meaning a slow and painful death. With the doors closed, they could rely on nobody but themselves to survive and pass this round. Suddenly, a squeaking sound shook everyone as they directed their gaze to its source. The hatch at the top of the dome in the center had opened. Yet nothing came out. This is unnerving. I'd rather they just begin, Rui complained. A transparent blob appeared through the hole. Here at Culm, his thoughts were interrupted as 99 other hatches opened simultaneously, and a bouncing slime appeared out of each one of them. Oh fuck me. It was difficult to fully appreciate the difficulty of tasks you've never attempted. Only after the 100 bouncing slimes appeared did Rui understand the gravity of the second round. Yet despite all that, he had the audacity to smile. No, not just smile, but grin like a madman. All 100 bouncing slimes dashed off towards the unwitting applicants, and what followed was the most chaotic experience Rui has ever undergone. Bouncing slimes doing as promised, bouncing and applicants doing as expected, getting bounced at. Rui had already been hit multiple times. Damn, this fucking hurts. Rui cursed as slime rammed into his ribs. They were as large as soccer balls, meaning their force somewhat concentrated. He shook it off and concentrated. He had already made several plans. He just wanted as few of his competitors to catch on. The biggest obstacle here is the fact that the attacks are omnidirectional. They can come from anywhere. With our limited field of vision, it is impossible to see them all. In that case, he turned to the closest applicant to him, who was also 13. This was by no accident. Rui had already known that the AoE nature of the ordeal would make it difficult to avoid getting hit. He had decided to team up with an applicant and watch each other's backs, and call every attack heading their way that they saw. He intentionally chose to be near a young applicant like himself. The odds of them agreeing to team up was much higher with a younger applicant, who would also be disadvantaged against older applicants. But before he could say a word to the applicant, he spoke to Rui of his own volition. Hey, wanna team up? Rui was taken aback. Not bad. The fact that he was able to realize the merits in this alone means he's worth teaming up with. Rui nodded, before they both faced their backs to each other. And the effect was noticeable quickly. Although they didn't dodge all the attacks from their blind spots, they did so at a higher rate than when they were relying on themselves. Still, Rui was getting hit more often than he didn't. Thank God getting hit doesn't give you negative points, otherwise probably not a single person here would score above 0, but this isn't enough. Right now, his performance wasn't really exceptional compared to the others. He needed to ensure he passed this round in order to that he needed to dodge more. Though he didn't have a concrete plan yet, he had already made several astute observations. I had only suspected it initially, but these slimes cannot seem to control their trajectories. Their trajectories were too random and inefficient. They really did bounce around like a non-living super bouncy ball. Specifically, their bounces obey the laws of motion and reflection far too much. This implies that the only thing determining their trajectories are the initial launch and the laws of physics. If they were manipulating their directions, their bouncing would most certainly not be consistent with kinematical predictions of their trajectories. Rui grinned. It's one thing if they could control their motion after the initial launch, but if their trajectories are driven by physics, then they can be predicted it. Of course, this was not a perfect solution. First of all, predicting all the slimes was absolutely impossible. He couldn't even see more than half of them because the rest was in his blind spot. Furthermore, predicting a large number of slimes, even if not all, required an extreme amount of focus which would almost certainly tire him out. He wasn't sure he would be able to predict the ones he could clearly see, but he had to try. Don't react after they bounce in your direction, react before they bounce. The laws of reflection are extremely simple. The reflected trajectory and incident trajectory will be in the same plane, and the angle of incidence will be equal to the angle of reflection. It's extremely simple to verify whether or not a ball will bounce in your direction. The problem is the number. I need to maintain realistic goal. I can forget about those in my periphery vision, but I should be able to manage the balls in my primary parafocal vision. He decided to ignore the slimes in the extremes of his vision, clenching his body and protecting the sides of his head with his hands, focusing only on the slimes he could clearly see. But unlike the other applicants, he wasn't looking at the balls that had already bounced off the dome ceiling. He was looking at the ones that had yet to. Quickly confirming or denying their future trajectories, he also reduced his movements to a minimum to make his task of observation easier. Suddenly, "Duck," Rui warned his partner. His partner crouched, but the slime came a split second later than he had expected. He was surprised Rui had managed to give him such an early warning. The same thing happened over and over until he realized Rui hadn't fallen down or grimaced in pain in the past 20 minutes. He was dodging all the slimes that came from the front and back, while permanently using his arms as shields to minimize damage from attacks from the side. Interesting, his physical capability doesn't seem to be too high, but he's dodging them almost as good as I am. Furthermore, that hair and eyes of his, could he also be a genius? The boy wondered. Chapter 15. Outcome. An hour and 12 minutes had passed since the second round had begun. Rui had grown more and more comfortable in his task of dodging, although it was still very taxing on him. The delays in reaction time, wastage in movements had decreased, albeit not by much. The real problem was no longer how to dodge, but how long he could dodge. His stamina had been well honed in the past 13 years, but ultimately he was 13 years old. His body was not blessed with great amounts of energy, and there was a limit to how much he could have trained as a prepubescent child, and a limit to the impact that the training would have prior to puberty. Huff. Huff. He wiped sweat from his forehead. He was sweating so much that it was starting to hinder his vision. "Can you keep going?" his partner asked nonchalantly. "Tisk, this brat. How on earth is he not tired? Furthermore, he rarely gets hit. He calls out slimes impeccably. He's accomplishing this through sheer field of vision, agility, reflexes and crazy maneuvering. This kid is a fucking genius. Are you rubbing your stamina in my face?" Rui barely managed to spit out a retort, narrowly avoiding a slime. "Ha, maybe duck," he warned. Unfortunately, Rui couldn't do so in time, and the slime grazed his shoulder. "Fuck," he grimaced. Yet the worst part is that the hit had diverted his attention, preventing him from reacting in time to another slime that was about to hit his head. He braced himself, waiting for the impact. And he waited, yet it never came. Opening his eyes only revealed a Marshal Squire standing in front of him. The slime nowhere to be seen. "He protected me? But why?" he wondered, dazed. "Wait, is the exam?" He knitted his eyebrows. Looking around, he saw a similar sight in all directions. The martial artists had intervened with their remarkable physical prowess. "The second round is now complete. Your results will be tallied and ranked within an hour." Master Aronian's voice echoed through the facility. "That means someone just died." Rui searched the facility before his eyes caught the sight of a young boy's corpse being covered and carried away. "Sigh, that could have been me," he thought, before dismissing the thought. "In the meantime, the assistant invigilators will provide you with stamina, nutritional and healing potions and any other medical aid you may need. The third round will begin only after the results of the second round are published." Master Aronian continued, rattling of a few more instructions. "You okay?" Rui's partner walked over to him, giving him a hand. "Okay enough, thanks." Rui accepted, getting up. "I'm Kane, by the way, Kane Arankar." "Rui Courier," Rui replied nonchalantly. Kane threw him an odd, curious look. "Something on my face?" Rui raised an eyebrow. "Well, that's just not the reaction I get when I tell people my name. It's a bit refreshing actually." Kane chuckled wryly. "You're from a famous family?" "Yeah, my dad is a martial sage. And my family has produced many renowned martial sages and masters in the past." That sounds cool. "No wonder you aced the exam. You're practically born to be a martial artist." Rui complimented, only to receive melancholic, helpless sigh in response. He could tell he touched a nerve, but he wasn't sure what. "I think you're pretty good too." They chatted lightly as they consumed several potions that healed their wounds and bruises while restoring their stamina. Rui had never actually consumed a potion in his life, though he had long learned of them. Potions were not something that the lower economic classes could afford, especially not an orphanage trying to fund itself. He'd never had the opportunity to try one. What surprised him the most was that potions were merely stored in liquid form. In order to be effectively consumed, they needed to be inhaled. That makes sense. I guess it's just a little counterintuitive to me since potions, in fiction, are always drunk. However, it would be impossible for potions that are drunk to be effective immediately, of course. Digestion is a long process. Whereas compounds directly inhaled reach cells extremely quickly because they're diffused into blood that carries them to every cell in the body, allowing them to be effective immediately. Furthermore, potions being drunk would be subjected to a number of chemical reactions that cannot be predicted, controlled, and accounted for. It's a poorly constrained means of administration of a complex compound, especially if organic in nature. Interesting. I wonder how these potions work. Did they have such high technology that they had synthesized nanobots that could enter the blood through the airway, allowing it to perform all kinds of operations on the entirety of the human body on a cellular level? It was practically impossible. Nanotechnology was the absolute pinnacle of materials science and engineering. How could a world have mastered such technology when they hadn't even discovered electricity? Their scientific progression is low, and their engineering clearly leaves much to be desired. Yet they can do things that even cutting-edge tech from Earth can't. This indicates that their technical prowess and understanding of this world isn't high. However, what is special is the world itself. The capabilities of their technology comes from the supernatural, but powerful resources that can be obtained, the powerful flora, fauna, and the bizarre nature of this world. This explains the oddities I've noticed throughout my second life. The lighting technology that relies on plants that glow, the communication technology that relies on supernatural creatures and phenomena, the remarkably intricate architecture and engineering that no doubt relies on something similar, and the medical technology that relies on a vast variety of supernatural phenomena and life forms. Most fascinating indeed. Cain noticed Rui's engrossed interest in the potions they were delivered. Have you never consumed a potion before? He asked, tilting his head with a surprised expression. Yes, this is my first time. It's fascinating. How come you've never had a potion before? He continued, confusion creeping into his expression. Rui turned his head, throwing him a puzzled glance. I thought he was intelligent based on how quickly he decided to team up, but is this kid actually an airhead? Because they cost 3 silvers? And? Rui looked at him with disbelief. And I can't afford to spend that much money on a product that can only be used once. Cain responded, feeling embarrassed and even guilty. He was used to drinking several potions of several kinds provided to him every day. He wasn't even making fun of me. He just seems to be so rich he has no frame of reference what normal looks like. This kid must come from serious money. Rui sighed. He decided to ignore it, continuing to banter with the kid. Just then, the assistant invigilators had appeared pushing a tall rolling board with a sheet of paper. It's here the results of the second round. Rui tensed. Chapter 16. Battle Royale. The results had arrived, and immediately a crowd had formed around the board. Fortunately, the notice board tall, and the rankings were boldened so that the crowd would not be able to block others from reading them. Rui and Cain had already gone closer to get a better look, so the results are ranked in ascending order of points, those with the highest points at the top. Each ranking has name, ID, points and whether they passed or failed. Rui noted. The board had also mentioned the average number of points per applicant, which in this case was 347 points. He began searching for his name rigorously. There were thousands of names, so this would take a while. The problem was he was reaching the end of the past section. He still hadn't found his name. Damn it, did I hey, found your name? You passed. Cain told him. Rui jerked. Where is it? Whoa, chill, it's right there, see. Cain pointed towards at the top of the first section. See, you got ranked 9th. He told Rui blankly. Rui stood there gaping as he beheld his ranking. He thought Cain was trolling him when he said 9th. But unless his eyes were also trolling him, it was the truth. What he mumbled in disbelief. He'd scored 706 points, putting him above 99% of his competitors. But how Rui was confused. Even after he teamed up with Cain, and even after he applied his tactics, he still got hit more than half the time. Less than 50% was generally a horrible score according to his academic sensibilities, but apparently the exam was so difficult for everybody that even this low score was quite remarkable. Rui sighed, trying to rein in his shock. Hey man, don't feel bad, 9th isn't a bad rank. Cain comforted him with him consoling smile. Cheer up, okay? Rui stared at him with a slack jaw. This kid, what's your rank? Rui took the precaution of asking before he decided how to retort. 4th. Cain replied with a relieved tone. Rui threw him a shocked look, before quickly verifying his rank. Amazing, this kid is something special all right. But why don't you look happier though? Father said that if I didn't get into the top 5, my play time would be replaced with more training. So I just barely made the cut. He replied with a tinge of relief and defiance. Seems being part of a famous martial family comes with its own fair share of tribulations. I trained out of my own free will. How could someone force a child to train so rigorously? Rui wondered. Another thing he noted was that Cain implied his father already knew what the test was, as well as about the evaluation method and passing criteria. I see. Sounds rough. Rui offered. It's a pain in the ass. Rui turned back to the board once more. From what he could see, roughly 60 to 70% of the applicants had failed. All around him, applicants seemed to be either relieved or disappointed. Large droves of applicants exited the facility until a much smaller population remained, having their wounds tended to or simply waiting for the third and final round. Rui glanced around at those who had passed and remained in the facility. These applicants were both determined and resolved enough to pass the first round, as well as talented and skillful enough to pass the second round. These guys are the real deal. They possess both the drive and qualifications to become martial artists. Everyone in the room could sense that too. Each one of them could see that everybody else was not ordinary. Rui once more drew eyes towards him than usual, not just because of his odd hair and eyes, but more so due to his ID, which belonged to the top 10. There were many who had looked for those applicants that managed to get into the top 10. After all, depending on what the third round ended up being, it could be of great help remembering the most dangerous applicants in here. Congratulations on passing the second round of the martial entrance exam. Before I divulge details of the third round, each of you will be provided with a badge with your score from the second round. You may not cover or store the badge. The third round is similar to the second round in that your objective is to obtain as many points as possible. The means by which you acquire points, however, will be different. It's very simple. The number of points you possess by the end of the round will be equal to the sum of the points of all badges in your possession. A spark of understanding flashed through the applicants. You may accumulate points by obtaining the badges of your fellow applicants, through any means whatsoever. Once again, your goal is to accumulate points. Only half of you will pass the exam. You will be evaluated on your performance. So basically, the final round will be a battle royale. Rui quickly realized this was bad for him. The people who scored the highest will become the biggest targets obviously. They're the ones with badges of the highest score. Among the top 10, I'm almost certainly the weakest in actual combat. I have no formal training in martial art whatsoever, my experience in combat is negligible, my physical prowess is inferior to all other applicants, Kane included. The only combat training Rui had done in the past 3 years was basic kickboxing practice. For punching and jabbing he would put himself through standard boxing training from earth, bag work, slip pad work etc. These were common boxing training exercises. Of course, he didn't have actual equipment, he had to be a little clever and resourceful. He'd used rice bags in place bag equipment, cloth-wrapped planks of wood nailed to trees etc. But he did this only so that he could familiar himself with the sensation of striking. It was by no means actual experience or even substitute for sparring. This is going to be genuinely rough. I'm going to become a complete target. I can forget about trying get other applicants' badges, I don't need them anyway with my high score. I need to everything I can to ensure that my badge doesn't get stolen. Chapter 17, Discovering the Path. Rui could already feel the attention of his competitors on him. Man, they're gonna come after us, Kane said, nonchalantly. Rui had forgotten about his acquaintance. He had been too absorbed in the imminent ordeal awaiting him. Kane was also his age. Furthermore, he had more points than Rui, so he was a more attractive target. But having more points meant he would be harder to beat. Ultimately, both their young ages meant they would be more alluring as targets. You sound confident, Rui noted. Yeah, the low rankers should be easy enough, but the high rankers are strong. I don't know if I can take their badges easily. The fact that that was what was on his mind means he's not worried about losing his badge at all. Rui sighed helplessly. He wasn't as confident as Kane. His lack of experience was not something that could be overcome easily. The most important rule of the third round is that the round will end when half the number of applicants lose a badge. With that, the explanation of the third round is over. We will begin the third round soon. Good luck. Rui narrowed his eyes. That rule is good and bad news. The bad news is that my attackers will be more aggressive now that there is a limit to the number of times a badge can be stolen. The good news is that I just need to hold out until the half the applicants lose a badge, which will likely happen quicker, because I probably will last longer than the lower ranked applicants. Rui concluded. My attackers will probably be mid or low ranked applicants. The higher ranked applicants have no need to target each other at all. Retaining their high scores alone will ensure they pass the exam. If they do bother stealing badges, they will likely target low-mid rankers who they will easily be able to defeat. Rui continued analyzing. Another important thing to note is that the fact that the goal is retain and obtain badges means that physical prowess isn't the only variable. Everyone has blind spots, regardless of how strong you are, and how strongly the badge seems to stick to your body. You could lose it simply by being a little careless. Kane nonchalantly hummed as Rui furiously evaluated his predicament and what course of action he ought to take. What makes you so confident you'll be able to retain your badge by the end? Rui asked. Ah, that's because I'm already a martial apprentice, Kane responded. To think this guy is already a martial artist. No wonder he managed to secure rank 4 despite being much younger than the top 3 rankers. I don't compare to him. What exactly does it mean to be a martial apprentice? Rui asked out of curiosity. Well, Dad said a martial apprentice is someone who has mastered the foundations of the fields of martial arts and discovered their martial path and manifested their soul. Fields? Martial path? Manifesting the soul? Rui asked, confused. Fields are like the fundamental different aspects of martial arts: offense, defense, supplementary, and maneuvering. These are the 4 primary fields that every single martial art must possess. Without offense you can never win, without defense you will always lose, and without maneuvering and supplementation you will not be able to use offense and defense in harmony. All martial arts need varying degrees of all 4, no matter how little. And the martial path is basically the journey of cultivating and creating your own martial art. Wait, what do you mean by your own martial art? Rui inquired, puzzled. Kane threw him a confused look at that question. Literally that, your own martial art. Wait, you're telling me every martial artist has their own martial art that no other martial artist in the world has? Kane nodded in response. Yep, Father said that martial art is a reflection of people's very core, their very souls. Since every single human being in the world is different, every single person will end up having a unique martial art. That's also what I meant by manifesting the soul. It means you've discovered your martial art. It's a metaphorical thing my father kept telling me. It's a pretty confusing way of saying it if you ask me. Kane shrugged. This was shocking to Rui. The notion that martial art was entirely personal and subjective, and unique to every single martial artist was shocking. On Earth, there were a small number of martial arts that people learned and combined, but to think that on Gaia, every single martial artist developed their own unique martial art was shocking. And also incredibly exciting. Rui fell in love with the concept of personal unique martial art that were metaphorical manifestations of one's soul. It was just so romantic. I wonder how my martial art will end up looking a manifestation of my soul. I've always enjoyed all martial arts on Earth. They were all fun and interesting, putting aside their effectivity. I also enjoy striking and grappling combat equally. I can't really picture how my martial art will end up looking. So what is your martial art like, thus far? Rui asked curiously. I only reached the martial apprentice stage a little over a year ago, so I haven't developed it too much. But it will end up being a maneuvering-centric martial art. I see, so that's why you were avoiding the bouncing slimes that well. Kane nodded in response just before Rui could continue asking more questions. Master Aronian declared the 3rd round begun. The 3rd round will begin the moment the doors shut close after I exit the facility. Good luck. The moment he said, the applicants immediately put distance between each other and took a stance, waiting for the round to begin. And with that, Master Aronian sauntered out of the room with lavish dignity, and as soon as the door shut close, chaos wreaked havoc. This is the final round. I'll hold on to this badge even if it kills me. Chapter 18, Round 3. Rui and Kane leapt back as several applicants immediately began targeting them. Tisk. Fucking scavengers. Rui cursed. Still, he wasn't able to suppress a grin. This was the first time he would be fighting. The first one to throw a punch looked to be around 15 years old, male. His form was terrible and his strike was practically telegraphed. Rui managed to dodge it while throwing a strike to his opponent's nose, aiming his middle knuckle at the tip. Whack tisk. It was slightly off target. But it was close enough. The nose was a particularly vulnerable spot. Getting struck there extremely hard caused pain and disorientation. Rui was resolved to land another strike while his opponent had openings. He threw a fully winded kick straight to his opponent's testicles, leaving him in agonizing pain. Rui, on the other hand, was ecstatic. Yes, my first combat victory. He celebrated before a powerful kick assailed him from the side, slamming into his arm. Arg! The ambusher rushed forward to grab his badge. When suddenly, not so quickly, Kane intercepted with a high kick that landed precisely on the applicant's chin, cleanly knocking him out. You okay? He asked Rui, helping him up. Yeah, Rui groaned. Tisk, I was too careless. I need to be more alert. I would have lost my badge if not for Kane. Rui scolded himself. Thanks for saving me, but you didn't have to. I know, it's just that it would be a shame if you didn't enter the academy. It hasn't been long, but you're fun to spend time with. He threw Rui an awkward smile. Rui snorted mirthfully in response. I owe you one. Don't worry about it, but don't get the wrong idea though. I can't help you much. Back then I was in a really sweet spot to knock him out, so it was easy. But this round will be hard. I can protect myself, but not you. Yeah, I know. I did not join this exam hoping someone would protect me. Rui steeled his gaze at the applicants that had begun to approach them. Their goal is my badge, but they need to reach within arm's length in order to take it. The key is to not let them get that close to me. I'll need to rely on kicks. Rui decided. It was also a conclusion that Kane himself came to. Kick, kick, parry, block, retreat, kick, kick, check, kick, retreat, block, dodge. This was a close one. He almost touched the badge. Kick. Rui had absolutely no sense of time. He had absolutely no idea how much time had passed at all. It could have been a few minutes, an hour, a few hours. Heck, maybe it had been a few days. Certainly feels like it has. He panted, arms on his knees trying to catch his breath. He'd gotten a moment's rest thanks to the fact that his targeters had been attacked by a few low-ranking applicants, buying him a brief but crucial reprieve. His tactics were not as effective as he had hoped they would be. For one, although kicks can be used to maintain distance, that's because their range exceeds that of punches or jabs. But I'm only 13 years old, my legs aren't really much bigger than the arms of my targeters due to the age gap. This was a problem because they could potentially rob his badge while avoiding a kick. They had come close multiple times, far too close for comfort. Secondly, kicks have range and power, but lower flexibility and greater demand for balance than punches, because you're balancing on one leg while shifting your center of mass greatly as a consequence of generating greater force. If someone gets super close while avoiding a kick, it's extremely difficult to combat effectively because it's difficult to stop the ongoing momentum and motion of your body in the middle of a kick, and also, because your body is balancing on one leg, it takes much more effort not to lose balance in such a scenario. This meant that if someone dodged a full-powered, max-range kick while moving closer to the person kicking, then the person performing the kick was practically screwed. At the very least, this was true at the martial apprentice or below level of skill. This further implied that Rui had to throw very light kicks. He could not afford to throw kicks that made it difficult to counter any misses. But lighter kicks generally had shorter range and power, thus it did not deter the targeters from attempting to close the distance. Rui had, of course, attempted to alleviate the problem. He attempted to do so by ensuring the burden of his weight was being supported and maintained by only one of his two legs at any point in time. This allowed him to throw kicks quicker. The reason was because normally, every time he chose to kick with a certain leg, he had to remove all of his body weight from that leg, the kicking leg, and shift onto the other leg, the supporting leg. This had to be done, and only then after could he launch a kick without losing balance. However, by permanently keeping his weight on one leg, he did not have to waste time shifting his weight every time. Thus, he had reduced the time period needed to throw light kicks. Furthermore, he had reduced the recovery time needed to defend properly should one of his kicks fail. These tactics and solutions were not revolutionary, nor were they extremely effective. But together they were able to allow Rui to barely hang onto his badge without losing it. Kane is doing much better than I am. Kane's maneuvering was truly amazing to Rui. Watching him move gave Rui the impression that his body was weightless. He has an extremely high muscle mass to body mass ratio. He's able to move his with great ease because that. He was able to narrowly avoid jabs and grabs, while simultaneously setting up attacks that exploited his targeters' openings. This seemed to be relevant what Kane mentioned to Rui about his martial art prior to the start of the round. So, this is a martial art, it's still in the earliest stage, but it's still amazing. Chapter 19. Gamble. From what Rui could see, Kane's maneuvering prowess came from both his exceptional muscle mass to body mass ratio, but also because of how light his body was. These two factors combined gave him extremely high agility and speed. But that isn't the only cause. Rui could see that his dodges were extremely efficient. He moved as little as he could to avoid, or at least mitigate the effectivity of the strike while setting up strikes of his own with his dodging motion. For example, if someone aimed a strike at his head, he would bend backward while simultaneously launching a straight high kick, while increasing its power and range by torque generated by bending backwards. He'd cleanly knocked out one of his targeters this way, and even took his badge. Just as Rui was admiring Kane's prowess, he heard a female voice call out to him. "You're an interesting one, aren't you, Rui Quartier?" Rui glanced at the person who called out to him as his eyes widened in shock. The silver-haired girl had many badges pinned all over her body. He couldn't even count all of them. Just how many people did she defeat? It's not too much of a surprise that the direct disciple of Sage Arankar made it to the third round with a high rank while still performing well at the age of 13. Although still very impressive. She smiled while throwing a gaze at Kane. But it's odd some no-name commoner 13-year-old boy lasted this long, and even flourish. Rui heightened his alertness. He recognized her. Faye Dullahan, she seemed to be 16 years old. She was ranked number 2 in the previous round. He'd memorized her face when she collected her badge. "You flatter me, I just barely made it here all this way. Even now I almost lost my badge many times." She gazed into his sharp eyes, taking note of his ominous hair and eyes. Suddenly, bam! Rui barely managed to block a heavy palm attack with a guard. She's fast. And more importantly, what the fuck was with that power? His arms were throbbing with pain. Not bad, you blocked that well, she noted as she continued attacking him. I don't see why someone like yourself would need my badge. Rui managed to squeeze out. Oh, I don't care for your badge, you can keep it. She responded innocently even as she pummeled him. Cain had noticed had predicament, but was too preoccupied. Furthermore, he did not think he could defeat Faye. She was too strong, it was too risky. She was the direct disciple of Sage Dullahan, her grandmother, who was an acquaintance of his father. Damn, hang in there Rui, the round should be close to over. Cain pleaded. It had been nearly half an hour since the round had begun and many applicants had lost their badges. He just hoped Rui would be able to avoid losing his badge before the round was over. Rui was bruised immensely. In a short time she had inflicted more damage on him than even an hour of the second round had. Her speed is lower than Cain's, but not by much, but her power is far greater. Rui had observed that she was only striking him by the base of her palms, reinforced by the radius, and ulna bones which constituted the forearm. It makes sense, her hands are small, palming would be more effective than punching. She wasn't particularly muscular, but her strikes delivered great force. From Rui could see, there were multiple reasons. Her arm is tough and rough. She's conditioned her entire arm. Rui grimaced as he endured her onslaught. Conditioning, broadly speaking, was a set of procedures or action performed by a martial artist in order to increase durability, toughness, hardness, and pain endurance of the parts of the body the conditioning was performed on, usually over a long period of time. Harder and tougher strikes inflicted more damage because they made the collision between the strike and the target increasingly inelastic. This was a scientific way of saying harder and tougher strikes hurt more than softer and weaker strikes. If one were to get hit by a beach ball thrown very hard, one would not get hurt. But what if one were to get hit by a steel ball that weighs the same as the beach ball and was thrown at the same speed? One would most certainly get hurt. The reason was because of the difference in their collision. The beach ball hit was an elastic collision where the energy of the ball did not get converted into damage, whereas the steel ball hit was an inelastic collision where the kinetic energy of the ball would get converted into damage inflicted onto the target. That's not the only reason this hurts though. She's using her power efficiently and every power uses her body weight. Rui noted, even though it hurt a lot. The sheer brilliance of her combat made him, a martial arts/combat sport junkie, extremely excited. Faye continued her onslaught with an intrigued expression. She noticed something strange. He smiling? It was faint, furthermore it was hard to discern under through his grimaces, but she could just barely detect excitement under all of it. Haha, he's enjoying this. He's an interesting kaithwak. She froze in surprise. Rui had just dropped his guard, crouched and rushed into her strike, allowing her palm attack to strike the top of his head hard. The sheer force by she had thrown the palm as well as conditioned toughness had caused a wound at the top of his head that had begun bleeding. However, he'd ignored the wound and dashed towards her waist, grabbing onto her thighs. I have you now, he screamed as he pushed her upper half while pulling her lower half. A takedown. This was what Rui had aimed for. He had not made this decision lightly. Prior, Rui made several astute observations. She's throwing straight palms and nothing else. It's likely because while palms are good at delivering impacts, they have very little inherent variation, because other types of trajectories require too much flexibility to be used regularly. It's also because she's holding back against me a bit. Another thing is that every strike she throws is close to max power from what I can tell, she twisting her body, drawing power from her core and her legs. This delivers great power, but it must be difficult for her to counter if someone avoids it. The problem was Rui didn't know how to avoid her strikes fully. She has too much speed. Furthermore, palms have a wider range of effect than fists. Dodging a fast wide strike like that requires preparation that she will definitely notice. I cannot take her by surprise if she notices, thus dodging and then closing the range is impossible. That leaves only one strategy, but it's a gamble. Dodging fast and wide strike required premeditated movements that would tip her off on his intentions. But allowing her to hit him did not. If he could simply rush in, endure the strike, not get knocked out by it, then he could attempt to take down and grapple with her. But what are my chances of not getting seriously wounded by her attack without a guard? Non-existent. He would definitely get hurt. Worst case scenario, he would just get knocked out. But he didn't really have any other choice. If I continue taking these palms, I'm doomed. This is risky, but it's better than certain defeat. He waited for a strike that had been aimed high. When it came, he dropped his guard and dashed to her legs, pretending the strike aimed at him did not exist. But it did, and it grazed a streak of skin and a little flesh off the top of his head, causing bleeding instantly. Fuck, that hurts. But he endured. Rui rushed in, grabbing her legs. He had fulfilled the plan. The question is whether the plan was good or not. He had few options in the first place. He could continue taking her attacks as she pummeled him to oblivion. He could run away even though she was faster than him and could attack his back and head. Or he could take a gamble that was risky and still very difficult, even if it succeeded. He had to choose the lesser of three evils. Did he choose correctly? Chapter 20. Outer Convergence. Abandoning a guard and haphazardly dashing for a takedown mid-strike was a very dangerous thing to. He could have easily been knocked out. Or he could have completely avoided the strike if he was skilled and experienced. The only reason the strike didn't knock him out was because Faye had been caught off guard, thus her reaction time was a little greater than normal. She wasn't able to adjust the trajectory to strike him in time. Yes. Now I can grapple her. This way her body conditioning won't really be too much of a deal. Furthermore, the mechanism by which her strikes were so powerful also cannot be applied to wrestling. I could potentially beat Bam. Rui spat out blood and immediately fell unconscious at her feet. Fu, to think he managed to almost get me. If it wasn't for 1-inch palm I might have had some difficulty. Faye mumbled, her palm facing upside down at waist level. Faye's 1-inch palm was an attack that allowed her to strike with maximum power in extremely close ranges. This was abnormal, because it was difficult to leverage the power of the core and legs in such a position. Usually, greater power required greater space. However, what Faye used was a principle that was simply known as outer convergence. Outer convergence allowed the user to use their full raw power in any position by stacking, summing, and converging the torque generated by all primary muscle groups to increase the power of a strike. There was a popular analogy used to understand what this meant in the martial academy. A child throwing ball at an adult would likely not hurt the adult. But what if the child was sitting on a horse that was running at top speed? Then the ball would possess the speed generated by the child and the horse. It would be moving very fast and would hurt an adult. But what if the horse was running on top of a giant dragon that itself was moving at 10 times the speed of the horse? Then the ball thrown would possess the sum of the speeds given to it by the child, the horse as well as the dragon stacked together. The thrown ball would be extremely powerful. This was because the power generated by three sources had been constructively accumulated and stacked together into one attack. This was exactly what the principal outer convergence was about. The different muscle groups in the body were like the dragon, the horse, and the child. The fist or palm in this case was like the ball being thrown. Outer convergence allowed the user to transfer the power to the strike in exactly this manner, accumulating and summing torque and force from all across the body additively and converging it into the strike. It was theoretically possible to do so in any position, but Faye had not mastered outer convergence to that degree yet. Still, being able to use flow accumulation at all in the form of the 1-inch palm was what allowed her to crush Rui's gamble instantly. Rui had failed miserably. He chose wrong. Still, if it had been 99.9% of the applicants here, they would have probably lost fame used. Rui Courier, how interesting. I hope you pass the exam. You do seem worthy of being a martial artist. She bade him, before leaving. His badge was stolen the moment she walked away. Rui opened eyes in a daze, unsure where he was. An unfamiliar ceiling. Only then did his memories kick in. Wait, what happened to the third round? I remember I was fighting Faye. Applicant Rui Courier, you're awake. A voice called out to him. You're currently in the medical wing of the Martial Academy. You fell unconscious during the third round of the entrance exam. Your wounds have been completely treated, so you may leave after gathering your belongings. A nurse of the academy. He noted her medical uniform. Damn, so it's over? Faye must have done something to me. I can't really recall what happened after I dashed for a takedown. He cursed. What about the results of the exam? You will be notified by the Martial Academy of the results of your exam within a few days. Rui sharpened his eyes. A few days? It shouldn't take that long since the criteria for passing or failing was simple. I probably had 0 points by the time the round ended, and 0 is most certainly below the average number of points. Is there a badge among my belongings? Rui asked nervously, just to verify. The nurse turned to face him. No, there was no badge on your person when the third round ended. I see. Deep grief and frustration assailed his mind. He'd spent practically his entire life preparing for this exam. He'd given the exam his everything. All for a complete failure. How long has it been since I was knocked out? Around 5 hours. Rui jerked his head towards her. Damn, I need to get back home soon or everyone will be worried. He changed back into his clothes from the medical garb he woke up wearing, before bidding the nurse gratitude and leaving. On the way back home he had a lot to think about. Fei was at a martial apprentice level 2 probably, just like Kane. She was the reason he failed. She attacked him on a whim and beat the living shit out of him for amusement. Yet, Rui felt no resentment towards her. Instead, he felt a tinge of excitement and anticipation building up. When will I become that strong? I can't wait. He would have been much more excited on any other day, but he found it hard to get excited right after failing the exam. 12 years. That's how long he'd invested. He'd spent those years doing his absolute best. It was not an exaggeration to say that Rui had done absolutely everything humanly possible to pass the exam. If it was anybody else, they would have likely not accomplished as much as he did with what he had. This was because of the sheer expertise, knowledge, and experience surrounding martial arts and combat sport. There were very few people with as much unadulterated raw love for martial arts and combat sports as much as Rui had. But it wasn't enough. Chapter 21. Home. The sky was dark, the edges of the sunset were dipping below the horizon. He'd spent nearly half the day away from home. Yet Rui was in no hurry. He was walking home peacefully in a nonchalant manner, contemplating what had occurred throughout the entire day. The first round weeded out a majority of the applicants, around 90% or so. The second round got rid of 70%, and the third round got rid of precisely half. That left around a little over 1% of the applications. Such was the tiny proportion of applicants that managed to pass the exam. Furthermore, even among the applicants who passed the exam, only a small proportion of them reached the martial squire stage. It was a brutal ordeal, one Rui had almost overcome. I wonder if Kane passed. He probably did. He hoped so, at least. Although he hadn't even known the kid for even a day, he was cool. Furthermore, he helped Rui out. A debt Rui promised he would pay back. Faye definitely passed too. There was no doubt about this either. He was pretty sure she was either extremely rich, or she was family of an extremely powerful martial artist, or both. He sighed. He didn't regret being born in the courtier orphanage, but there were undeniably benefits that he missed being born in a lower class of the economy. Still, I'd stick to the orphanage if given a choice. He smiled warmly as he thought about his family in the orphanage. The pain of being separated from them was not something he wanted to voluntarily put himself through. As his mind wandered, he kept trudging through. He was in a very dull mood, but he didn't feel regret at the very least. I gave it my all. He shrugged. What more could a person do? Besides, although he was almost certainly done for, the official judgment had not been released yet, so who knew? Anything was possible. Rui stopped walking as he reached the gate to the orphanage. He almost didn't want to go inside. He didn't want to be in the center of attention while he was still saturated with shame and frustration. The problem is with me, not them. They'll console and encourage me. Rui sighed before entering. The door opened before he reached it, and Farian could already tell what had happened based on Rui's expression. Don't worry about it, come in, dinner's ready, he said before gesturing Rui inside. Rui smirked slightly. It was a very Farian way of consoling people. He was not someone who would bear his thoughts and emotions directly but would still convey what he wanted to. His words just then roughly translated to, I know you didn't achieve what you wanted to, I know it sucks, but for now come and spend time with the family you love, we're here for you. Yeah, I'll do that. He scratched his head walking in. I'm back. Lasharda looks to be full of pure relief. Out of all those in the courtier orphanage, she cared more for his well-being and life than his first attempt at the martial entrance exam. She'd scanned his body top to bottom, an embarrassing ordeal for a 13-year-old, but even more so for a 72-year-old. But he allowed her to do it. He owed her that much at least, after ignoring years of overprotectiveness to eventually attempt the martial entrance exam. Of course, his wounds had all been treated by the medical department, so there was nothing to fear. But did that deter Lasharda? Looks like Mom might even force you to sleep beside her out of anxiety. Nina smirked. Anything but that. I haven't done that in 6 years. Rui complained. Well, how did it go? Julian asked, despite already knowing the answer. I failed in the final round. Rui sighed in response. Shame, don't worry, you can try again next year. The fact that you made it to the final round in itself is actually quite remarkable. But how do you know you failed if the official announcement isn't out yet? He was aware that the martial academies sent official letters stamped with the seal of the Kandrian Martial Union declaring admission of the candidates who were accepted as students while setting up an appointment with the candidate or with the guardian. The objective of the round was specified, and I perfectly failed to meet it. There's no way I passed. I see. Well, don't worry about it. Let's start eating. And so they did. They discussed boisterously about a variety of topics rapidly, forcing Rui to take his mind off the exam, which he was grateful for. Master Aronian had just finished grading the final round of the entrance exam. Only 567 applicants had passed the entrance exam in the Kandrian branch this year. As the appointed head invigilator of this year, he was given full discretion regarding the exam, and as long as he didn't go overboard, he could do whatever he wanted. Normally, he considered this duty a dull chore, but this year's applicants were interesting, to say the least. The top-level talent in this year's batch is impressive. There's Kane Arankar, son of Sage Damien Arankar. Based on his performances, his overall skill and combat capability was at the martial apprentice level. Extremely impressive that he managed to discover his martial path at the age of 13, a genius with unknown potential. What is interesting is how vastly different his martial art seems to be from that of Sage Arankar. Sage Arankar's Devil Fury Fist is a striking martial art that heavily emphasized on raw power and durability at the cost of speed and maneuvering. Although I didn't particularly expect Kane to go down the exact same path, it's a little strange he chose the exact opposite. Kane had chosen a martial art with a strong focus on speed, agility, and evasive maneuvering at the cost of a powerful body. Martial arts are manifestations of the soul, in a sense. For Kane to have focused on evasiveness and chosen a completely different path from the Arankar family tradition, I wonder how this bodes for Arankar household. Chapter 22. Interested. Although there was nothing concrete, Master Aronian could smell friction between Kane and Sage Arankar. Well, it's none of my business. Another applicant he was interested in was Faye Dullahan, yet another descendant of a sage. 2 of them in a single year is quite rare. She also was worthy of her status in his eyes. She consistently dominated the rankings with ease. What particularly impressed Master Aronian was the fact that she managed to learn how to use outer convergence. Although he could tell she hadn't mastered yet, the fact that she managed to use a high-end apprentice-level technique was rather impressive. He couldn't wait to see where her martial journey would take her. Then, of course, is him, Master Aronian said, looking at a shear with a picture of a 15-year-old boy on it. The boy had long, messy white hair and unnervingly wide blood-red eyes, with a wild grin on his face. Rank number 1 nil. He wasn't even a commoner, he was below that. From what the admissions department of the Martial Academy had learnt about him from their background check was that he was a child who was raised by animals till the age of 3, when he was discovered and rescued by humans. Although he eventually adjusted to living like a human by the age of 15, he still retained the savagery and ferocity he had obtained living with beasts. He was territorial, cruel to the weak, and seemed to have obtained a strong urge for physical conflict. Master Aronian even suspected he got off of it, considering he actually killed several applicants in the entrance exam with expressions of unadulterated, almost innocent joy and pleasure. He hadn't studied martial arts even a little bit, but he signed up for the Martial Academy anyway. And he was monstrously strong. In the second round, he was the one contestant who didn't get hit by a slime at all. He successfully dodged or destroyed every slime. Faye had challenged him towards the end of the third round, but unfortunately for Master Aronian, the round ended before the fight could reach a conclusion. I regret making the third round so short. He sighed. He wasn't entirely sure which one would have definitely won had the fight continued, but he knew it would be extremely close. The 2 contestants were nigh equal. What particularly impressed Master Aronian about Nell was his ferocity and tenacity. Nell grew up in the lowest strata of society in the poorest and most dangerous of districts. He had a lifetime of experience of not just sparring or training, but fighting for his life, every day. He had a shockingly unpredictable, unconventional fighting style stacked atop a body blessed with high physical attributes and powerful senses and instincts. He was an outlier, a beast. Using his unparalleled senses and reflexes, he was able to dodge or destroy all slimes from all angles. This was something Faye, despite her age and pedigree, could not replicate. And finally there is him. Master Aronian glanced at Rui's profile. Rui was much of a deviant as Nell was, in Master Aronian's eyes. 13 years old. No formal martial arts training, well above average physical attributes as a result of training, considering his age, but not too much of note by itself. Average physical performative attributes too, slightly above average skill, but again, nothing special. Though the fact that an untalented child like him fact that he reached this level without formal training speaks of great determination and hard work. Still, this was not the most shocking part about Rui. What is truly impressive was his mind. He's an unparalleled genius. He did not make that statement lightly, no martial master would. Despite possessing unremarkable physical and physical performative attributes at the age of 13, he managed to score above 700 in the second round and secured rank number 9. Furthermore, he did this purely tactically with absolutely no other attribute contributing majorly. He observed the slimes, drew hypotheses and conclusions regarding the slimes, and the exam itself, tested the hypotheses to confirm or deny them before devising a set of tactics aimed at fulfilling the objective to the highest degree possible, centered around predicting the trajectory of the slimes rather than reacting to them. This was an instance of analytical and tactical ingenuity as well as sheer processing capacity absolutely unheard of in an applicant, let alone one as young as Rui, according to the martial exam library. Usually only highly experienced martial artists who were also inherently intelligent could accomplish such feats. Unfortunately, he lost his badge to Faye, but he still held out longer and acted better than likely anybody else would have with what he had. Not even Nell pushed Faye far enough to hastily use her 1-inch palm against her will. Master Aronian thought quite highly of Rui, on par with the aforementioned geniuses, even though Rui would have undoubtedly lost to them in a fight. None of the other applicants had held Master Aronian's interests. Although they were all mildly different and some even unusual, it was nothing that Master Aronian, an experienced invigilator and teacher, had not seen many times. He set aside the profiles in his hand and had begun stamping on the letters of acceptance and rejection with the official Kandrian Martial Academy stamp. The seal pattern on the stamp was extremely intricate, and even the materials it was crafted from were from high-grade esoteric bestial matter obtained from powerful beasts. Forging a counterfeit was actually extremely difficult. Furthermore, the ink itself was a compound derived from esoteric flora. It absorbed light of all colors, and thus was an absolute pitch black that did not shine or reflect any light. These were means by which credibility and reliability were ensured. Just then, he came across Rui's letter. The decision of course had already been made, it could not be changed now. He just wondered if it was too hasty. Well, what's done is done. I'm interested to see what you do from here, Rui Courtier. Chapter 23, Letter. Rui was lying on his bed the next morning. He had been contemplating about his path forward from here on out. The official announcement hasn't come yet, but I should forget about it. What I ought to do is eradicate the cause of my failure. He was doing fine until he fought Faye. But what caused that loss? Well, he was outclassed physically and technically, in skill. She was on a whole other level. He still didn't even know what she did to him in their fight. The last thing he recalled was dashing towards the lower half of her body for a takedown, grabbing her, and then the lights went out for him and he woke in a medical facility later on. She knocked me out, obviously. The question is how. He wasn't sure how. He was especially confused on how she managed to generate such raw power when caught off guard, mid-strike with her whole body still in motion in the failed strike, at point-blank range. Was such a thing even possible? With Earth's martial arts, that was impossible. No MMA or UFC fighter would ever be able to generate such absurd amount of power, enough to instantly knock someone out like that at point-blank range. But she did how? This served as a little reminder that he knew too little about the martial art in this world. On Earth, both humans and martial arts had hard limits. But as he had witnessed 12 years ago, neither humans nor martial art had hard limits like this. The laws of physics were somehow still the same, as he'd noticed. This world obeyed the 3 laws of motion, Newton's law of gravitation, rotational mechanics, kinematics, Euclid's axioms, etc. Yet, somehow, the limits that the universe and Gaia had placed on humans seemed to simply not exist. He wasn't sure if this was something could ever be investigated through scientific induction, the scientific method. But did he care? No, not really. I'm grateful for it, of course. It allows me to live in a world of my dreams, and live a life of my dreams. But I don't really care why this reality is so different. I'm not a cosmologist or a theoretical physicist. I will simply exploit the opportunity this reality has presented me with, and fulfill the dream I couldn't fulfill in my previous life. Still, it begged the question he hadn't answered yet. How did she knock him out so quickly? He didn't know, and it didn't seem like he could figure out either. Someday I'll reach that level, I'll reach it and far surpass it. He leapt up from his bed with renewed vigor. I'll work even harder and definitely pass the exam next year. Rui, you passed the exam. Rui tilted his head towards a boisterous Alice running towards him. You passed the exam, she screamed, shaking him back and forth. Rui couldn't understand. Is this her way of cheering me up? Alice's cheeriness was always abnormal, but this is something else even for her. Your letter came. She shoved a paper into his chest. It says you passed the exam. Huh. Rui squinted his eyes in skepticism as he looked at the letter. There no why, he choked when he read the letter. Greetings, Mr. Courtier. We are pleased to inform and congratulate you have passed the Kandrian Martial Entrance Exam and have been accepted into the Kandrian Martial Academy. We have evaluated you as a student candidate of our academy thoroughly, and you have indeed demonstrated that you are more deserving of a seat in our academy than your peers. We write to you to do more than just congratulate you. We invite you to the official induction in the Kandrian Martial Academy on the 36th autumn at 14 p.m. There, important matters such as the rules and regulations, fee structure, payment method and structure, scholarships, housing and food amenities, schedules, and academic year structure and other facilities and amenities will be presented in great detail. You may consult with our staff on any inquiries you have after. You will also receive your student identification and uniform. It is an extremely important and necessary meeting, so please make sure to attend it. If you cannot, then please make sure to book an appointment with our staff prior to the start of the academic year on the 66th autumn. And lastly, this letter serves as the official invitation to the induction. Please bring it with you along with identification. Rui memorized the relevant information as he read every single word with great scrutiny. We look forward to meeting you. With sincere regards, Tilda, the admission department of the Kandrian Martial Academy. The letter ended after rambling on for a while about details, but the important part had already been conveyed. I'm accepted, I'm accepted, I'm accepted, he asserted, chuckling. I'm accepted. The realization had finally struck his core. He began guffawing uncontrollably until he grew embarrassed enough to stop. But how did I pass? I lost my badge, and the objective was to retain and accumulate badges and points. I objectively failed that task. Now I'm definitely going to find out how I didn't fail in the induction. Alright. But still, I got in after all. Yes. Rue. I can't wait to begin. Rui. Sai, you were so engrossed you didn't even hear us. Alice said with tired helplessness. Oh, I didn't notice you guys here, sorry. Rui said as he realized a lot of people had gathered around him. He was scolded by the adults for being so self-absorbed, but ultimately everyone congratulated him. It was a well-known fact within the orphanage that Rui dreamt of becoming a martial artist. Congratulations, Rui, you made it. Julian smiled at him. Thanks. I have to say, I am extremely surprised. I thought the chances of you passing the exam at the age of 13 were practically negligible. Thanks for the vote of confidence. Rui snorted. Still, the fact that you made it through despite your low odds is the strongest testament to your sheer determination and perseverance. If it's you, you'll be able to tread the martial path to the very end. Julian smiled warmly. Hindsight is 20/20 they say. Rui retorted playfully. That's a mean thing to say in response. Rui smirked thanks. Chapter 24, Induction. A week rolled by and the induction ceremony of the Kandrian Academy had arrived. The event was held in the morning on the 36th winter, which would be the 6th of October on Earth. There were multiple calendar systems used on the Panama continent, but the most universal one was the calendar of systems. The year was divided into 365 days, just like on Earth, but the days were not grouped into months. Instead, they were grouped into seasons. The 36th winter referred to the 36th day of the winter season. This was one of the many differences in the cultures between Earth and Gaia. It had taken Rui a while before he got used to them completely. Come on, Julian, we might be late. Rui urged. Julian threw him a helpless sigh. We already resolved to leave a whopping half an hour early in anticipation of traffic. Leaving any earlier would be silly. He told Rui. It's rare to see such a childish side of him. All right, fine, but don't waste any more time. Rui relented. Yes. The reason Julian accompanied him was because all applicants below the age of adulthood of 16 needed to be accompanied by a guardian, or an adult who would serve as an acting guardian. Lashara had requested Julian to accompany Rui as the acting guardian, and in order to aid Rui in the induction. By the time they reached, they were, as perfectly predicted, half an hour early. See? We're this early and you wanted to be even earlier. Julian poked at Rui. Hey man, better safe than sorry. Rui yawned. Sleepy? Not at all. You stayed awake all night excited about the induction, didn't you? Julian sighed. He really did think Rui's childishness manifested when it came to his passion and love for martial art. They followed the directions to the induction hall after showing their ID and invites to the guards at the gate. The induction hall was a large facility that seemed to be explicitly designed for presentations of this sort. On the outside, it was large and ostentatious in its architecture, clearly designed to grab attention and demand admiration from its beholders. On the inside, there was a large stage with a podium upon it at the opposite end of the hall. The hall actually descended downwards as one moved forward, with the stage being the lowest in elevation. It had a wide carrying capacity, clearly designed to accommodate the large number of new students and guardians that attended the induction every year. Truly, an extravagant hall that does the prestige of the Martial Arts Academy justice. Julian sighed in admiration. What held Rui's attention, however, was not the hall itself but its inhabitants. So these guys are my batchmates, eh? Indeed, I hope you make a lot friends. I didn't come here to make friends. Rui shrugged. Yes, but it doesn't hurt to make a few. Good friends can have overall positive impact on your life, maybe even on your martial art. It was possible, Rui supposed. Speaking of which, didn't you make a friend in the exam? I knew him for a few hours at most. He's an acquaintance at most. Rui said, before feeling guilty. Kane had saved him in the 3rd round. Does that make us friends? Rui wasn't sure. In his past life, he had never made any friends, his disease and the nature of his career simply prevented him from making any. He'd also developed a relatively asocial attitude due to that. True enough, I suppose. The accepted students were all strong, Rui could feel it. He wasn't sure he could beat most of them in a fight. Even though he was in the top 10 of the second round, he didn't let it get to his head and blowed his ego. His success in that round was a rather niche outcome, and wasn't something that spoke to his overall combat ability. Ultimately, he was younger, weaker, and less experienced than pretty much every single other student in his batch. The only other kid my age was Kane, and he was a fucking genius who was personally trained by a martial fucking sage. I'd have to have my head deep up my ass in order to think I'm comparable to him just because our ranks were somewhat close in the second round. Rui clenched his fist. It doesn't matter how strong I am currently. I have a lifetime ahead of me. This is what the martial academy is for after all. He couldn't wait for the academic year begin. He intended to grind and train like a madman under the tutelage of the martial seniors of the academy. Just then, Rui saw a figure board the podium. Master Aronian surveyed his audience, sweeping his gaze across them. Students of the Martial Academy. This time, allow me to welcome you all to the Kandrian Martial Academy not as aspirants, but as members. Each and every single one of you belongs within the walls of this academy. You have overcome tribulations as well as your peers and proved without a shadow of a doubt that you belong here. Be proud of how far you've come, yet be cognizant of how much you have left to traverse. He spoke calmly with sagely dignity. Today we aim to inform you about the everything you need to know and ought to know about the Martial Academy. Without further ado, I invite our Honorable Chancellor Calix Hain to begin the presentation. A strapping younger man walked onto the stage as an applause ensued. Master Aronian shook his hand before deferring the podium to him and walking off the stage. He smiled before cutting straight to the chase. The purview of this presentation is to provide you with an overall understanding of how the Academy functions. I shall broadly be going over several categories of topics. The educational services the Martial Academy offers to its students. The responsibilities and entitlements that students possess. The fees structure and means of payment. And finally, the future that lies beyond the Academy. The primary service that the Academy provides to its students is, simply speaking, the tools necessary to allow students to reach the martial squire realm. The curriculum is not set in stone universally, beyond the bare foundations. The martial path is a deeply personal journey that cannot be universalized, yet the conditions necessary to become a martial apprentice and then a martial squire are defined. The Martial Academy possesses a vast library of techniques and skills that can freely be explored by students in order to discover their martial path before pursuing it. The Martial Academy offers the tutelage of highly qualified and experienced martial seniors who have all guided countless students into discovering their martial path and aided them in their journey down it. We offer a variety of highly refined training regimes and facilities for all physical and performative attributes relevant to martial art. Simply put, the Kandrian Martial Academy is a paradise for those who strive to become martial artists. As he began rattling about the details, Rui pondered about his words. I see, so in order to reach the martial apprentice stage and discover your martial path, one must explore different types of martial art techniques, skills and forms, eh? That makes sense. After all, how else can one figure out what kind of martial art they want to pursue? In that case, having a library of techniques and skills definitely makes life far easier. Hell, is it even possible to become a martial apprentice without such resources? Regardless, just based off this alone, the Academy was already worth every ounce of his time. He probably wouldn't be able to reach the martial apprentice stage any other way. I'm not like Kane after all. Without the Academy, I'll never be able to obtain these learning resources. The sheer amount of resources the Academy dedicated giving its students the most optimal education possible was mind-boggling to Rui. His astonishment only escalated as every time the Chancellor presented yet another ostentatious facility that targetedly trained one particular physical or performative attribute or a foundational skill of some kind. Is it really worth it to spend so much on us students? I've heard that only 10% of students reach the martial squire stage. Is it really worth it to spend such a large amount of capital into nurturing less than 100 martial squires every year? He wasn't sure. He lacked too much information on the interests and decisions of the Union. Perhaps there were several concrete economic and political incentives to increasing the number of martial artists than just money. Perhaps he would learn of these reasons once he jumped up the totem pole of the martial union. I should stop focusing on abstract irrelevant matters and focus on things have a more direct impact on me. Rui shook his head. In addition to the facilities, amenities and services I've just gone over, there exists the possibility of being tutored by a martial master. Of course, this is a decision that is entirely of their own discretion and volition. There are no guarantees, promises or stipulations regarding this. There have been several years back-to-back where not a single student was chosen by the martial masters of the academy, and conversely, there have been years where a plethora of students were accepted by various masters. On average, a few students are accepted every year. The benefits, of course, cannot be overstated. In addition to extremely high-quality tutelage, martial masters can allow disciples to obtain opportunities that other students cannot. With the vast authority they possess, they can easily circumvent the restrictions and barriers blockading resources, knowledge, events, etc. Rui grew excited when he heard that. The prospects of being tutored by a martial master was incredibly exciting. Their prowess was known to be extraordinarily high, and unless one was their direct descendant, the prospect of one being accepted as a disciple by one was extremely low. Martial masters were very powerful, influential, and naturally wealthy. It was difficult to earn their tutelage services even with a small fortune. Chapter 25, Disciple. Ideally, a master ends up offering me tutelage once I become a martial apprentice. The problem is the low probability, as well as the difference in criteria that master evaluate potential disciples with. Every master must be looking for something different in the students. The only thing that can be inferred is that they are likely looking for unique traits. After all, it wouldn't make sense if what they were looking for could be abundantly found in every student. If that were the case, being accepted as a student would be a trivial and easy matter. Thus, it could be inferred that the likelihood of being accepted as a disciple of a master was greater the more unique one was. So now, the question is whether I'm unique enough. Rui scratched his head. Well, I'm reincarnated, that's something I'm relatively certain no other student can claim to be. But revealing that is asking to be burned to the stake as an alien. Even if they didn't believe me, they'd at least conclude I have screws loose in my head. Nothing about this option is a desirable outcome. The problem was that Rui wasn't sure he was all that unique in practice. The martial entrance exam had shown him that. Sure, my scientific background and research experience in martial arts and combat sports allows me to pull a few tricks like I did in the second round of the martial exam, but that's it. That's not too big a deal. It allowed me to cope with the difference in prowess between me and the other applicants. But is that something that would warrant the attention of a martial master? Rui didn't think so. Another thing that likely influences their criterion is compatibility of martial arts. I highly doubt a martial master with the defensive martial art would take in a student with an offensive or maneuvering-oriented martial art, no matter how brilliant that student was. That made sense. Why would a martial master bother with things that weren't their specialty? That also implies that the students that do get chosen are probably martial apprentices. Assuming they choose students with compatible and similar martial arts, then only those who have discovered and chosen their martial art are eligible to be chosen. That meant that the best thing Rui could do to be eligible was to reach martial apprentice. He highly doubted whether or not martial masters bothered with students below that rank. Students who hadn't broken into the martial apprentice rank weren't even martial artists, they simply weren't worth the time and attention of such august figures. So, ultimately, neither my goal nor my decisions have changed. I just need to become a martial artist worthy of their attention. Far easier said than done, Rui realized, but he wasn't going to let that stop him. And that about wraps up the first segment of our presentation. Chancellor Callux concluded, smiling. I'll be moving on to the rights and privileges and responsibilities of students. As an introduction, allow me to inform you about the goal and interest we sought to achieve when the Academy framed the current iteration of rules and regulations, as well as rights and privileges of students. We wish to create an environment where students can dedicate their time and energy into developing and pursuing their martial art without unnecessary burdens, hindrances, or restrictions. The framework of rules and regulations is centered around the goal of preventing students from hindering and obstructing themselves or other students through undesirable practices. The guidelines we present are aimed at helping the students adopt the right mindset and temperament needed to become successful martial artists. We have a rigorous student evaluation system that measures misdemeanors, as defined by the Penal Code of the Kandrian Martial Academy's rules and regulations. The consequences for too many misdemeanors will be straightforwardly be expulsion. The Academy seeks to retain only those students that have the drive to become martial artists. Another thing that I will go into is, of course, most of the students who managed to crack the exams were usually all those who strongly wished to become martial artists, otherwise they would not have passed even the first round. Yet there was a smaller proportion of students who managed to pass the exam without possessing a pure drive to become a martial artist. The strong penalties for misdemeanors and violations were amended into the rules and regulations of the Academy for this very reason, etc. All of this is, of course, merely the philosophy and principle driving the rules and privileges students possess, not the actual rules and privileges themselves. You will all be provided with a rulebook when you leave. I strongly encourage all students and all guardians to read them thoroughly. he said, as he held up a copy of the rule book. That book is thick as fuck. Rui groaned inwardly. Heh, looks like you'll have a lot of reading to do when we get back home, Rui. Julian chuckled mirthfully. Tell me about it. Can I ask you to read it and then give me an abridged version of it? Don't load your work off of others, young man, Julian said, while playfully karate chopping Rui. This is part of the process. Rui sighed. Still, he was glad to see that the rules were taken seriously and were seriously enforced. Back on Earth, bullying was rampant because schools simply lacked the faculties by which it could enforce them. Teachers couldn't be bothered with bullying unless it was too far. They simply weren't paid enough. A lot of kids suffered from antagonization, particularly amongst the teenagers. They couldn't rely on the teachers. And if they decided to take matters into their own hands, the situation would escalate, and the conflict would be intense enough for the school to be involved. In such cases, victims almost always were punished for escalating, while bullies received punishment to a lesser degree or in some cases none at all. I have no fucking interest in dealing with that nonsense for a second time. Rui clenched his fist in anger. He had been bullied in middle school and high school. He was a weak and scrawny kid who would start gasping for air every time he grew tense. After all, one of the major driving forces for his motivation for martial arts back on Earth was because he admired the strength that martial artists possessed. They could fight for themselves no matter who, no matter what. That's so cool, Rui recalled thinking as a child in his previous life. Of course, as he grew up, so did his love and passion for martial arts and combat sports. What was once a childish infatuation for the aesthetics and exaggerated strength matured into an intellectual passion, causing him to go down the path of becoming a researcher of martial arts and combat sports. I guess, in some way, I ought to be grateful to my bullies? Rui shook his head, the mere thought if that was repulsive. Putting that aside, it seems I won't be re-experiencing that one more time in this academy. Assuming this chancellor isn't talking out of his ass. Rui threw a skeptical glance at him. It was the induction ceremony of the academy after all. What chancellor would talk shit about their academy on this day? If anything, it was possible he was just covering up the true state of the academy with vague, flowery lies that were merely meant to dress up the academy. This wasn't an uncommon phenomenon in his previous life either. Well, to be fair, he did just describe an intricate student evaluation system. It would be one hell of a lie if he blatantly fabricated all of that. Usually when representatives of institutions lie about the state of affairs, they're vague and ambiguous, but he's been nothing but detailed, elaborate and precise, even now. Rui noted while listening to Chancellor Calux's words carefully. Well, the only thing I can do either way is wait and see. He would find out what the academy was like himself, soon enough. He took careful mental notes of the extensive presentation on the rules and regulations, the rights and privileges and the means by which they were enforced. This brings us to the final segment. The future that lies beyond the academy. Chancellor Calux continued. The academy, as you all know, is owned and funded by the Kandrian Martial Union. The union invests in students in order to maintain a fresh supply of martial artists. Part of the reason for this is of course to compensate for the martial artists that perish in missions. Part of it, eh? It seems there's more to it, just as I suspected. Once you graduate, you can immediately register with the Kandrian Martial Union. The union has a flexible contract system. Graduates with higher capabilities as measured by the academy will receive more favorable contracts in regards to the commission cost cut you receive. Your performance in the academy will impact the contract you negotiate with the union. Chancellor Calux smiled.